A beautiful blonde in a fluffy red dress named Vishnahel Loravi Kismalos was the only princess of this cursed country. A few seconds ago, the princess was executed by 4 enraged bulls tearing the victim apart. Our princess folded her arms and tried to understand why she was once again sitting in the death row waiting room. Vishnahel Loravi thought for a long time and assumed that she had most likely returned to the past, to the moment before her execution. She saw a guy in a red uniform with a round watch in his hands and was sure that now he would tell her that it was time to go out. The man took out his pocket watch and, looking at the time, began counting down the seconds remaining until the execution. Vishnahel, hearing the man demand to get out, grabbed her head and began screaming that she was not going to do anything. The princess began to go crazy and did not believe that she had been returned back in time, even before the execution with the use of enraged bulls. She bit the iron bar with her sharp teeth and resisted, but the guards tied her up and she was sent off to be executed again. Vishnahel was tied by the head and limbs with ropes and did not understand why she had to relive this horror again. Closing her tear-stained eyes with terror, the princess began to pray to the god of her family's ancestors, the Kizomalos, hoping for their mercy. Princess Vishnahel recalled that her faith in the gods had weakened recently, and her offerings to them were rather meager. The princess clasped her hands and feet and swore that if God appeared to her, she would dedicate every second of her life to serving him faithfully. Suddenly, a golden-haired boy dressed in Greek clothing appeared and informed Vishnahel of his arrival. God Kizomalos, the progenitor of the family, smiled and asked his descendant if she had called him to help her. Seeing Kizomalos, Vishnahel became furious and, angry that he had not come earlier, she punched him in the face and knocked out a tooth. She continued to beat the god for not coming earlier and subjecting his only descendant to such shame. Kizomalos, shielding himself from the princess's blows with his hands, asked her to stop and listen to him as quickly as possible. Sitting down at the large negotiating table, Vishnahel said that she was an honest fighter and would give him a couple of seconds to justify himself. The golden-haired god, seizing the moment, spread his hands and informed the princess that they had serious problems. Vishnahel continued to beat the god for allowing her father to destroy the country, and the golden-haired one justified himself by saying that his power had weakened. The princess was confused and stopped beating him after hearing that his divine power had indeed weakened. Kizomalos explained to the princess that the more immoral his descendants were, the stronger his divine authority became. Vishnahel stood there with her fist in the air, unable to understand why the god was uttering such an absurd idea about divine power. Kizomalos asked her to calm down and stop getting worked up prematurely, and to listen to his explanation on the matter. He explained that in order for divine authority to grow and strengthen, descendants must live the same way their ancestor lived, otherwise the family will decline. Kizomalos said that one should have lived by indulging in passion and vices and not acted like some kind of saint, and that's where they are. Vishnahel, seeing how Golden Hair hovered over the table and told her about the situation, could not believe his words. Having learned that the family's authority and power only grew if the princess behaved worse and more recklessly, she took a different path all this time. She recalled that all this time she lived correctly and followed her conscience every moment of her existence. But the princess realized that she did all this not because she wanted to, but because it was right. The reason she wanted to be the best was because she was the worst emperor in the history of the Kizomalos dynasty. Vishnahel was the daughter of this emperor and empress, which she did not like very much. He was nicknamed the Puppet Emperor because he handed out government positions for large sums of money. He had 20 official mistresses, and the number of illegitimate ones was simply countless. The worst thing was that the emperor was an uneducated idiot and did not understand, and did not want to understand, anything. He did not read any documents, especially those with seals, and entrusted them to ordinary servants to deal with them. People who didn't understand this did business as they pleased, raised taxes, and created loopholes for themselves to avoid paying them. In the end, the emperor, who left an indelible stain on the dynasty, was beheaded in the main square of the capital. Vishnahel thought this was fair until the duke appeared and sentenced her to be drawn and quartered. The princess understood that even if it had been poison or the guillotine, it was simply unfair to do this to someone who wanted to save the country. The duke stated that the princess did not see the suffering of the people and did not intervene until the emperor brought the country to shame and announced her execution. Vishnahel, who was being held by force by the guards, shouted that she did not agree with the duke's words and called him a dog. She claimed that she was trying to save her country and was not inactive, but was trying to ensure that the treasury lasted as long as possible. Vishnahel recalled her childhood. While she was locked up and learning to run the country, everyone around her was having fun as best they could. The princess wasted no time in training herself in martial arts, not sparing herself and falling from exhaustion without strength. Hooked up to a glucose drip, Vishnahel worked for her emperor, sorting through papers and documents. The princess did not understand why she was being humiliated so by the duke, who appeared out of nowhere, and she especially did not like the absurdity of being quartered because she did not behave recklessly. Kizumalos consoled the princess, who thought she had wasted her life, and asked her to get ready as soon as possible. The princess did not understand what she should do and how she should pull herself together if she was executed by quartering. The golden-haired man didn't hear her and continued, waving his arms, repeating that he and the princess had huge problems. Vishnakal attacked the god and began to strangle him, saying that the biggest problem was precisely the death of the last heir. Suddenly, the sound of gears and clock hands began to be heard. The princess stopped and began to listen to them. Kizumalos spread his hands and informed Vishnahel that he had borrowed some divine power to save her from death. His own power, unfortunately, was not enough to turn back time, so he had to borrow it. The princess had to gather all her divine power and repay the debt, otherwise she would be quartered again by enraged bulls. Kizumalos rose into the sky and told Vishnahel that she was a fool and needed to gather her strength until she returned to that day. The princess shouted that she was not a fool, but a direct descendant of the foolish ancestor god, and looked at the flying away Kizumalos. The golden-haired man smiled and said that she was absolutely right, continuing to rise higher. Kizumalos said that she would go back 16 years and asked her to gather as much divine authority as possible. The golden-haired man took out a microphone from somewhere and sang that 16 is the prime of youth. Vishnahel could not believe that Kizumalos was her ancestor god. She saw it as a shame. The golden-haired man suddenly began to apologize for his mistake and informed the princess that she would have to go through the execution again before regressing. Vishnahel burst into tears and began to smile from a nervous breakdown, realizing how much pain she would have to go through again. She didn't understand how incompetent her Kizumalos must be to allow his descendant to die twice. The golden-haired one encouraged his last descendant and said that he would believe in her until the end. Vishnahel, tied with ropes, was simply smiling hysterically while being executed and could not answer anything. Having regressed into a child, she admitted that she had lived wrongly, and from now on she would live only recklessly and as she wanted. Sitting on the bed wearing a dress with a teddy bear was the only princess of this empire, Vishnahel Loravi Kismalos. Just a few moments ago she was executed by quartering, and now she has rolled back in time, becoming a 5-year-old. Vishnahel reflected on the fact that she lived in a world in which much depended on divine power and status. Entire families can live in luxury for generations depending on which family god they have and how high his rank is. The princess, realizing how low their rank was, did not understand how her father, the emperor, could destroy an entire empire in 1 generation. Vishnahel suddenly realized that she was lisping again, and the maids suddenly burst into her room talking about a good day. They handed our little princess a tray with a cup and said, "If you feel a choking sensation in your soul, drink a cup of water." Vishnahel took the whole bowl with one hand and drank the contents in 1 gulp. Realizing that there was some strange red liquid in the bowl, she immediately spat it in her maid's face. Throwing the bowl away, she began to scream and ask the servants who dared to poison Her Highness the Princess with this nasty thing. All the maids knelt before Vishnahel and, asking for forgiveness, asked her to take an antidote to relieve the paralysis of the tongue. The brunette raised her fist with a serious face and shouted that, despite the fact that the princess was furious about the snake, she needed to take the medicine. The second maid offered the princess her favorite candy in the form of a stone on a ring to cleanse her taste buds. Hearing about paralysis, Vishnahel suddenly remembered this terrible incident that happened in her childhood. One day, one of the emperor's mistresses gave her a paralytic poison to drink, for which she was later executed by beheading. Unfortunately, the paralysis did not go away, and the little princess suffered for 2 whole years, lisping like an idiot. After thinking about the fact that she didn't want to lisp for 2 years in a row, the princess decided to drink the antidote. The maids praised Vishnahel for making the right decision and offered her a double dose of the antidote for paralysis. The girls continued to admire the princess, claiming that the future of the empire was in good hands, and the princess, hearing this, agreed that she was smart. Vishnahel forcefully placed the bowl she had drunk onto the tray handed to her and, lost in thought, uttered Emily's name. The maid proudly knelt down on one knee and meekly accepted her new name given to her by Princess Vishnahel. Having asked what date it was today, the princess was convinced that her golden-haired god had told her everything correctly. Waving her hand, she dismissed her maids, who bowed respectfully and said goodbye to their lordship. After putting the facts together, Vishnahel realized that she needed to raise the status of her god before she turned 21. The princess was terrified by the fact that because of the debt her god had taken, if she failed, she would be quartered for every piece not returned. Vishnahel remembered again how Kizomalos explained that in order to raise her status, she needed to live her life like a real wild child. A princess must not just live like a fool living in her house, but in style and on a grand scale, so that everyone will remember. Lord Kizomalos may have been a wild child, but he was surrounded by talented people who looked after him and raised his status. Vishnahel also decided to gather talented people around her and restore the family's strength, finally returning it to its greatness. The 5-year-old girl, lying on her bed and waving her little legs, finally decided everything. Holding up her ring-shaped caramel, she promised herself to become the most stylish and reckless princess. Having gathered all her maids and put on stylish slippers, the princess went to fire her teachers to hell. Princess Vishnahel justified this conscious choice by saying that she no longer needed an education and would live recklessly. Realizing that there was a special charm in rebellion, she decided that she would dress however she pleased and hang out wherever she pleased. The little princess and her maid stopped to take a closer look at something interesting along the way. Vishnahel's eyes lit up and she saw something incredible that inspired her greatly. In front of her little body stood the very same elephant-shaped slide that our princess had dreamed about her whole life. The maid, seeing the princess rushing towards the slide like a bullet, shouted that it was too dangerous, but the princess had to ride it. A second later, the princess was already sliding down the slide in the form of an elephant at high speed, which greatly frightened Emily. Vishnahel, having descended, immediately shot up into the air like a bullet at the angle of the hill and flew away. Having skillfully applied her not-forgotten martial arts, the little princess, having grouped herself, sank to the ground. Vishnahel had a smile from ear to ear after such entertainment, and she immediately wanted to repeat it. Climbing that elephant slide again, she wondered how she had ever lived so many years without ever trying it. Deciding that she needed to make up for all the lost time, she decided to go sledding every day. The princess crossed her arms and was already looking forward to the next time when she suddenly heard someone order her to get off the slide. The guy in the red shirt, surrounded by maids, was angry and demanded that the princess get off immediately because his dad bought it. The blonde man in the red shirt was the emperor's son named Trinity, and he continued to threaten the princess, saying that she was finished. Vishnahel adjusted her jewelry with her left hand and, sticking her tongue out at the boy, asked if he even knew who she was. The little princess overdid it and found herself in an awkward situation, biting her tongue due to the effect of the paralysis poison. The boy got angry and started yelling at the princess and vigorously shaking the elephant-shaped slide she was sitting on. Vishnahel, seeing what this brat was doing, became very angry and ordered him to stop shaking the slide. With her arms crossed over her shoulders, Princess Vishnahel began to quickly descend the slide, seeking to punish the boy. A boy in a red shirt pushing a slide noticed a shadow hanging over him. It was a princess who was flying straight towards him. The princess, reaching the head of the impudent boy, hit him on the head for swinging the slide and yelling at her. The maids ran in terror to separate the children, but the princess continued to furiously beat her attacker, who was unable to fight back. Princess Vishnahel Lorowi-Kismalos found herself in a prison for political prisoners on the very first day of her reckless life. The Duke, reading a book, slammed it shut and tried to figure out why he was hearing a child's voice in the prison. The jailer threw the only princess, the heir to the throne, behind bars on the orders of some small-time idiot. Vishnahel did not understand why. For just a few blows to the crown of the emperor's son, she was put in a prison cell. The little girl, sobbing with the volume of a pterodactyl, was unhappy that she had ended up in such a place and hated everything that was happening. The guard was worried and warned the princess that if she continued, the emperor might become very angry with her behavior. The princess didn't care about this idiot. She got a big microphone from somewhere and was going to give a concert. She got into character and began performing her composition called "Let Me Out," waving her arms and closing her eyes. Princess Vishnahel continued to sing her song into the microphone, continuing to sing louder and hit higher notes. Suddenly, there was a powerful blow behind the little girl, and a small piece of stone broke off from the wall. Vishnahel was frightened when she saw this, but did not immediately understand what was going on, assuming that she had taken too high a note. A curious little girl looked through a hole in the wall and saw a man who told her that she was singing too loudly. The Duke sat looking at the floor and said that prison was no place for a child, and asked why such a little girl had been put there. The princess didn't lose her composure and told the man sitting opposite her that she had simply given a little brat a beating. Vishnahel said that, being a princess, she beat up the emperor's son, the Duke. Upon hearing that she was a princess, immediately apologized. The princess ordered the Duke to look at her with respect, but he reported that he could not understand anything because of her lisp. The princess took the microphone again and told the man that he was a commoner and could not talk to her like that. The Duke said that he had behaved rudely and asked for mercy, and to leave his anger, the little girl accepted the apology and forgave him. The man lifted his head from the floor and asked the little princess why she had hit that little boy. Vishnakel said that she saw a slide in the shape of an elephant and decided to ride it, but the emperor's son began to chase her away and be rude to her. The princess folded her hands, proudly closed her eyes, and said that everything in the kingdom belonged directly to Her Majesty. The duke, hearing this, thought about it and was dissatisfied with the fact that such a spoiled child would one day rule the country. The man looked at the princess and asked if she had been able to win, and the princess, pleased with herself, confirmed this fact. The duke looked encouragingly at the princess and said that the most important thing was indeed victory. Vishnakel speculated that difficult individuals end up in political prison and assumed that he had protection. The princess was delighted because she could, with this low-born man, throw as much mud at her idiot of a father, the emperor, as she liked. The little girl collapsed on the floor, closed her eyes and tried to understand what was going on in her father's head, since he allowed her to be here. Vishnahel raised her head because she heard the guard address her. The boy opened the door of the prison cell and, turning to the princess, said that the emperor was calling her to see him. Vishnahel thought that her cretinous father had finally come to his senses after his opium dreams and agreed to go. The duke asked if the princess was leaving already. She replied that the imperial heir would not be able to register in this kennel. After some thought, Vishnahel decided to release the duke and asked him to wait for her for a while. The coolest princess had already begun to devise a plan to free him, thanks to the bonds forged by their foul language. The princess, accompanied by a guard, thought that the emperor had gone crazy and had gone to summon her to the empress's palace when the empress herself was not there. Approaching the doors, which were guarded by a guy in a white suit, she remembered that the empress was not present at all. Her mother was a stately, dark-eyed brunette, and the last empress, the eldest daughter of the Loravi family. The empress, Vishnakel's mother, could not stand the idiocy of her husband and decided to burn herself and him, but the emperor survived. During this performance, the idiot acquired a permanent tan on 50% of his face, and for the next 6 months he couldn't look at meat. In addition to this, the emperor was unable to recover from the psychological trauma and still has not appointed a new empress for the country. Vishnahel assumed that if her emperor dad was hanging out here, it meant he had bequeathed the palace to one of his mistresses. A guard in a white uniform escorted the princess, who was unhappy with this violation and worried about what her ancestors would say. Vishnahel was disappointed that the emperor did not even put on a shirt and did not send his proforsetka out of the room. The emperor, standing before his daughter in a single sheet, reproached her for having no manners and for not greeting him. The maids, seeing this, immediately ran up to the little princess and, taking her by the shoulders, began to lower her and tell her that she needed to kneel. The emperor asked Vishnahel why she hit Trinity. She said that she finally found out the name of this baby. The father ordered his daughter to apologize to her brother and her mother. The princess replied that her mother had been burned alive. The emperor slapped Vishnahel across the face and ordered her not to mention her name in his presence again. Holding his hand, he repeated his order to apologize to his brother and mother. The princess, her cheek red from the blow, did not want to hear her father and said that she could not, because her mother had not been resurrected. The crazy father raised Vishnahel by the hand and ordered him to stop angering him on purpose. The princess did not agree and shouted that the rightful heir would never dare apologize to some weakling. Vishnahel freed herself from the hand and smashed a container with some red liquid, splashing it across the floor. Grabbing a candle from the table, she began to threaten the emperor that if he didn't come to his senses, he would put on a fire show just like her late mother. The emperor became frightened and began calling the princess a scoundrel, and Vishnahel continued to threaten with the candle. The little princess found herself back in her cell after her prank, and the duke greeted Her Highness the Princess. Vishnahel greeted the man and allowed him to rejoice, and also asked him to patch up her little cheek. The duke became frightened and, wiping the smile from his face, asked the little girl how badly she had been wounded by the emperor. Vishnahel said with tears in her eyes that her mouth was covered in blood after the slap, and she didn't have time to burn her daddy to hell. The princess continued to complain to the duke that the last time he simply kicked her when she got in his way, which angered the man. The little girl took out her big microphone again and started screaming into it at the top of her lungs for them to bring her a doctor. The duke smashed the wall with his fist, which greatly frightened the princess, who cowered in a corner from the blow. Covering herself with her hands, the princess said that she was shocked by the events happening to her and could not believe her eyes. The duke, blowing dust from his fist, looked at the little girl and asked how she was feeling and if everything was all right with her. The blonde Vishnahel, with a cut on her cheek, lost her voice and simply looked at the huge bearded man in her cell. The bearded duke looked closely at the baby and said that she looked like a small cookie called a gingerbread fish. The bearded man gathered his strength and with a powerful kick knocked down the locked iron door of the prison cell, surprising the little girl. Leaving the cell, he ordered the guard in red to protect the princess, to which he only wished him a safe journey. The princess looked at the events happening to her with large, uncomprehending eyes, trying to figure it out. She started cursing at the Duke's special effects and said that if she got sick or caught a cold, it would be his fault. A security guard and a doctor in a white coat and with a large first aid kit in his hands immediately appeared and asked if everything was okay with the baby. Vishnakal, with a hole in the wall and red eyes in the background, scolded the doctor for asking such a stupid question. The doctor immediately apologized to Her Highness and, taking the instruments in his hands, sat her down on the bunk and began to conduct an examination. Princess Vishnahel had a bandage put on her cheek, and in the Duke's cell she saw his book and wanted to read it. The little girl, seeing the table of contents of the book, understood that it was forbidden literature and was not surprised why the man was there. The Duke returned, frightening the princess with his appearance, and reported that he had just kicked the Emperor's insolent ass. Vishnahel couldn't believe that he had just taken revenge on the Emperor, and on top of that, he had returned back to her cell. The princess, reasoning that he had some kind of incredible roof, tried to understand why he then looked like a grizzly and was sitting here. Vishnahel turned to the shaggy Duke, looked at him again carefully, and told him that he was a boar. The Duke looked at the princess, smiled at her, and agreed that he was a real pig. After examining the man again, Vishnahel ordered him to shave as quickly as possible, and he reported that he had beaten the Emperor in her name. The princess looked dubiously into the Duke's eyes and asked why he had done this when he had not been asked. The Duke was embarrassed when he listened to what Vishnahel was talking about, and he was especially embarrassed by her thoughts about self-gratification. The princess reasoned that this was the greatest engine of progress, but is it worth it to desire the applause of the crowd and all the lights go out? The Duke asked Her Highness to finish the lecture as quickly as possible, to which Vishnahel simply wanted him to control himself. The princess also reminded that one should be careful with forbidden things and not be so obvious with such books. Vishnahel was exhausted and was already yawning. Having informed her boar about this, the princess asked him to be quieter and went to bed. The bearded Duke put the princess to bed, covered her with a blanket, and wished Her Highness sweet dreams. After a few moments, Vishnahel began to snore sweetly and watch her dreams, and the boar watched this process. The little princess was furious at the food they were trying to feed her and threw the table into the passageway outside her cell in anger. The guards apologized to Her Majesty and explained that the food in prison is always like this, and the warden even skimps on salt. Vishnahel raised her hand and ordered that while she was here, her food was to be prepared by her personal chef. The guards fell on their knees, thanking Her Highness for such generosity, and promised to carry out her orders. Vishnahel, still with a plaster on her cheek, was pleased with herself and turned to her large neighbor, the boar. The princess asked the Duke if he wanted to tell her something. The man ironically asked her if she knew about masturbation. Vishnakal got angry, folded her arms, and, offended by her neighbor, called him an ungrateful goat. A guard in red arrived at the Duke's cell and, after greeting him, handed him a tray of delicious food. Vishnakal, seeing this, took a beautiful strawberry and put it on a tray for her cellmate and wished him bon appétit. The princess added that she did it only for her own self-satisfaction, and the boar noted that she couldn't help but tease. Vishnahel explained that she took this trait from her aunt Loravi, and now she never wants to bend over the boar, noted the Loravi name. The Duke, with sad eyes looking at the wall, said that this family had conspired with his uncle to kill his parents. Princess Vishnahel was afraid that she had most likely touched her neighbor's sore wound and apologized for her aunt. Borov said that there was nothing to apologize for. They died because of their weakness, and they themselves seized lands in the same way. The Duke's uncle sold him to the imperial family, with their eyes on his inheritance, and they immediately sent him to the battlefield. The guardian did this, hoping that he would die in battle, but the boar survived, returned, and killed the uncle's entire family along with him. The Duke explained that his retribution was truly just, but he had come here to atone for his guilt. Vishnakal, hearing this, realized that he had a conscience, and judging by his beard, he had been atoning for his guilt for quite some time now. The Duke handed the tray to the guard, and the princess said that he needed to live his life and his youth, and not rot in prison. The princess addressed her neighbor through a hole in the wall and demanded that he offer her his hand. Vishnahel moved the box, stood on it, and grabbing the hand, began to remember something, closing her eyes. She tried to remember how to say it correctly, going through words like "in the name of the kitty" or "kitty," swore and just couldn't say it correctly. The Duke looked closely at the princess, who remembered and said, "in the name of the true ancestors of Kisomalos." Smiling broadly, she told the boar that she would forgive him for all the sins he had ever committed. Having ordered the Duke to continue living freely and to do what he wanted, she also ordered him to shave off his beard as soon as possible. Princess Vishnahel asked the boar to behave decently at their next meeting and told him to promise. The Duke was very pleased to hear all these words, and with a smile on his face he gave his promise to the princess. The boar, overjoyed, ran up the runway and kicked down the cell bars with all his might, surprising Her Highness again. Once outside, the Duke knelt down for a moment and thought about something for a moment. The guards did not resist him, but only wished him a safe journey again, and the man ran down the corridor. Vishnahel again did not understand anything, and simply watched with her mouth open what was happening in the next cell. Having come to her senses a little, the princess shouted after the boar about where he had rushed off to, and even without her. After the boar escaped from prison, Princess Vishnahel was asked to return to her chambers immediately. Most likely, one of the father's henchmen quickly drew up a release document to avoid being targeted. The little princess was already lying on her crib, chewing gummy worms and leafing through a magazine. She was already thinking about how to get rid of the emperor. Vishnahel opened her huge eyes in surprise when she saw something incredible in the magazine she was leafing through. It was boots with ducks on them. She remembered how she had dreamed of such boots all her childhood, but royalty were not allowed to wear such absurd footwear. Princess Vishnahel immediately jumped up and began calling her personal maid, Emily. The dark-haired maid arrived, knelt down and put her hand to her chest, and announced that she would be Emily's attendant today. Vishnahel jumped on the bed with a smile from ear to ear and showed off those very duck slippers in her magazine. Emily, with wild eyes, ran at lightning speed to buy slippers from the merchant who arrived at the castle. The little princess, having folded the magazine into a tube, was already looking forward to trying on her new flip-flops with squeaking ducks. A lady in a green dress with red hair and a beautiful green hat came into Princess Vishnahel's chambers. Entering the room, she looked at the baby with crazy eyes and screamed the princess's name at the top of her lungs. Vishnahel, clenching her fist in one hand and her magazine in the other, recognized the woman as her aunt named Kazelna. She was the youngest and only sister of the late empress, and was also the current head of the Larovi family. The princess remembered how this loud-mouthed person would scream like crazy every time the topic of dignity came up. This woman always forbade everything that did not correspond to her opinion of dignity, and even tore up the first love letters from the princess's admirers. She always compared Princess Vishnahel to her mother, and also taught her embroidery and knitting because that's what her mother did. As a result, by putting in her 2 cents everywhere, she greatly limited her position in the imperial house. Vishnahel looked at the woman and tried to understand why she was here and not fighting on the battlefield. The princess became angry just from the memory, especially because she did not save her from execution because she was at war. The red-haired aunt turned to the princess and asked what she had done to end up in prison. Grabbing Vishnahel by the face, she began to ask what had happened to the little princess's face. Looking closely at her niece, she reflected on how the girl resembled her mother in face, only her eyes were inherited from her father. Vishnahel couldn't do anything but think how creepy this was and why she was listening to all this. The aunt scolded the maid for not having brought the divine crystal to treat the princess yet. Divine crystals are a valuable resource created by the gods of healing. Even a low-ranking crystal can, for example, reattach a severed arm. Thus, the crystal of the supreme god is so expensive that even if the princess's castle were sold, it would still not be enough, but the aunt decided to pay for the crystal. Vishnahel reminded that her aunt had no more money, as she had spent all her funds on the war. The princess advised her to get married, to which the red-haired girl took offense and promised to tickle Vishnahel to death. Auntie's punches were incredibly fast, and the little princess barely had time to dodge their speed. Dark-skinned Emily entered the room, holding those same slippers with the duck over her head, and called out to Her Highness at the top of her voice. These were beautiful ducklings, which the maid managed to successfully intercept so that Trinity would not get them. Vishnahel was shocked by what she saw and highly praised the maid for her excellent work, while her aunt was perplexed. The little princess quickly climbed onto the bed and made her maid let her try on the ducks as quickly as possible. Having put on the lovely boots, Vishnahel was very happy to hear how loudly they quacking when walking. The little princess continued to happily slap her slippers and make quacking sounds, something she had dreamed about all her childhood. Auntie would have liked to object to something about royal dignity, but Visha was too cute in those slippers. Emily wanted to laugh, but she couldn't, because it was a crime worthy of death. Vishnahel, seeing this, patted the maid on the back and promised to come up with some kind of punishment for her for this. As a sign of her gratitude, the little princess allowed Emily to be present at her bath. Bowing before the duck-shaped slippers, the maid said that she was immensely grateful to the princess. Auntie also wanted to go swimming, but Visha forbade anyone to enter except Emily. The maids took the aunt, who was calling her niece, by the arms and carried her out of the princess's chambers. Vishnahel looked at what was happening with sadness and thought that she had not realized before how annoying her aunt was. The little princess, having taken a bath with a towel on her shoulders, sipped something from a glass, seeing a small kitten in it. Plopping down on the bed, she shouted that banana milk after bathing is real happiness. Vishnahel was glad to be rid of her annoying aunt and to have acquired the quacking slippers. The maids who entered the chambers looked very rumpled and with faces swollen from blows, which embarrassed the princess. Vishnahel stood on the bed, and the maids immediately fell to their knees. The princess asked if they wanted a new punishment. Emily raised her head and said that the mongrels from the Empress's palace had gotten out of hand, and they had decided to teach them a lesson. The princess was embarrassed that some concubine was behaving as if she were a real empress, and was already thinking about how to teach her a lesson. Vishnahel had the idea that it was necessary to find a person who would fight this pink partridge in her place. The first thing the princess did was order her maid Emily to prepare whatever she ordered. A tall man dressed in a black cloak was watching the princess's domain. It was Borov, who had finally shaved his beard as he had promised, and said that he was going after the little princess. Vishnahel decided to park her butt near the palace, set the table, and sit here until the emperor woke up. The princess will do this together with Lady Bridget, the future new passion of her idiot dad. Vishnahel recalled that before returning to the past, her father had found himself a new favorite, which had shaken the pink-haired girl's position. The new favorite was the count's daughter Bridget, and the princess decided that she would personally palm off a new passion on her father. The two girls sat down at the table set by Vishnahel, and the maid began to serve them tea. One of the girls was Bridget's sister. The princess decided to wait until the mistake of nature woke up and push one of the girls right into his arms. Vishnahel was stunned because she suddenly realized that she had no idea what the people sitting over tea were talking about. The little princess has spent her entire life studying and working, and doesn't understand these kinds of parties at all. Smiling and looking at her reflection in a cup of tea, the princess tried to think of a topic for conversation. Finally, the best topic came to Vishnahel's mind, and looking at the smiling girls, she began the conversation. With a serious face and holding out her hand, Vishnahel asked the girls what they thought about taking the fortress of Laruris. The girl, hearing such a question, was a little confused and asked whether the princess was talking about the construction of the kingdom of Medea. And then their imaginations ran wild, and the ladies found themselves at a table with a map and were discussing poisoning food to weaken the fortress. Vishnahel, putting on dark glasses, said that with such a reinforced concrete defense, it would be easier to poison the water. The girls were inspired by the theme and began actively developing the idea of capturing the fortress and weakening the enemy. Princess Vishnahel was very confident in maintaining the conversation and was carried away by their talk. Vishnahel became engrossed in the conversation and began to describe a detailed plan for an attack on another state, which frightened the ladies. The sisters became very nervous upon hearing such reasoning and asked Her Highness to stop at this point. Vishnahel had to continue talking about the fortress, and also blurt out something about mothers and daughters, because the father did not want to wake up. Suddenly, someone came, slamming their foot on the ground, and asked who dared to shout so loudly near the emperor's palace. The princess, delighted by the arrival of the evolutionary error, and also her father, hoped that he would take one of the girls. The sisters lowered their gaze, stood up, placed their hands on their chests, and began to ask forgiveness before His Majesty the Emperor. The emperor, with his hands folded behind his back, cursed that he had not been able to rest well, and now they would pay dearly for such an insult. The sisters were deeply distressed by what had happened and promised to submit to any will of His Majesty. The emperor, taking advantage of the situation, came up from behind, put his arm around the sisters' waists, and invited them to listen to their justifications. Vishnahel, looking at this picture, assumed that now the favorite is not one of two, but two at once. The little princess, watching what was happening, concluded that her daddy was simply hopeless. After the idiot emperor had new favorites, the pink-haired bitch's arrogance immediately diminished. Vishnahel, observing the favorites, noticed that they were doing even better than she expected. Christmas was approaching in the kingdom, and each god had to give his precious gift to one worthy person. Only the official successor of power had the right to receive the gift, and since divine power worked according to seniority, it was the eldest who received the entire jackpot. Vishnahel also celebrated her birthday after Christmas, but since her god's power had run out, instead of a gift, she would pay off his debts. Suddenly, little Vishnahel's worried red-haired aunt appeared in her path. She grabbed the little princess in her arms, lifted her into the air, and was scolded by the girl for such behavior. The aunt wrapped her niece in her dress and asked her to hide her head and not to utter a single sound. She carried the baby, hidden in a dress, out of the castle, saying that most likely it was Chiron who attacked them. Vishnahel thought the name sounded quite familiar and peered out of the dress with curiosity. She imagined herself sitting on her aunt's lap, dressed as Santa, making wishes, thinking it was a surprise. Unfortunately, this was not a surprise, and the castle was attacked by some elite squad of fighters. The aunt, seeing the battle taking place, tried to escape from the castle as quickly as possible and save little Vishnahel. The little princess thought that in this confusion, her daddy would be killed and that it would be the best Christmas present. Vishnakal, seeing the enemy detachment, did not understand why they were going on such a suicidal mission, especially when her aunt was known as Storm of Explosions and served in the Imperial Army. Suddenly, a guy appeared on the way to Vishnahel and the rescuing aunt and addressed the woman by name. It was a young, tall guy in uniform. He put his hand on my aunt's shoulder and asked her to stop. Redhead smiled and playfully asked how he dared to block her path, knowing who she was and what she was capable of. The guy pulled at his clothes and warned that if she left this place now, she would definitely die. The aunt smiled and said that he would be the only one who would die, but the guy only beamed upon hearing this and confirmed her words. The aunt was very surprised and asked if the Duke really did not want to harm Her Highness the Princess. The guy, continuing to hold on to his jacket, repeated that he really wanted them to go with him. Opening his cloak, he was wearing a Shahid belt and threatened that if they did not agree, they would all die. The aunt called the guy a psycho who wanted to blow up half the palace and hugged her niece as tightly as she could. The guy said that he was saying this in all seriousness and was not threatening them, but was simply following the orders of a certain Ende. He said that Ende is not serious and can hang around for years, and then asked to be given divine power and so on. Vishnakal was tired of all this fuss, and asked her aunt to let her go as soon as possible. The aunt continued asking the guy how exactly he was connected with Ende. He explained that he killed his relatives. The princess and her aunt were horrified to hear this, and began to sympathize with the loss of the young man. The guy laughed and said that they had asked for it themselves, doing all sorts of things, which reminded Vishnakal of someone. The little princess, finally free, took her aunt's arm and asked the boy to walk them home. Vishnahel was in a hurry because she wanted to see this stranger named Enda as soon as possible. On the throne stood that same boar with the shaved face, and his legs lay on the back of the most stupid emperor. The palace of the idiot father Vishnakal was slightly destroyed, the roof was especially damaged and the walls were cracked. The guy opened the door for his aunt and the princess, and the little girl announced her arrival to the entire hall. Vishnakal screamed at Borov because he dared to sit his butt on the throne, and her dad, kneeling, looked at his daughter in fear. The Duke replied that he hadn't seen her for a long time, and the princess had gained a couple of kilos, to which he received the legitimate answer that everything was fine with her, and he was a goat. Vishnakal continued to scold Borov, claiming that he knew nothing about her, and he asked where she had picked up such bad manners. The aunt bared her teeth and became furious, promising to kill all the idiots, even at the cost of the princess. The Duke promised to carry out Princess Vishnahel's choice, and her father immediately began whining like a dog for her to choose him. The little princess asked the boar to explain his thoughts more clearly, to which he replied that he simply did everything as he wanted, following her advice. The Duke explained that if Vishnahel chose his father, he would take responsibility for everything that had happened and commit suicide. And if the princess chooses him, then he will protect her forever. The girl did not fully understand, so the guy with the bomb promised to explain everything to her. Writing it all out in detail on the blackboard in chalk, he explained that Enda Kiron, after being released from prison, suddenly decided to become her father. After all this, an operation to destroy 3 generations of this family began, and now everything depends on Vichy. Another option was to entrust everything to Larovi and put Vishu on the throne without intermediaries, but Auntie was not at all in the political mood. Having collected all her thoughts, Princess Vishnahel finally realized that the same Borov from prison was sitting in front of her. The Duke, without batting an eye, looked at the princess and asked who else she wanted to see there. She raised her finger and began to justify herself by saying that first impressions count, and she remembered him as a bandit. Borov rose from his throne, kicking the unfortunate father, and reminded him that his subordinate was carrying a whole mountain of explosives. The princess, not very worried, patted herself on the head and praised the Duke for being such a crazy person. The Duke said that he often hears these words, and for him they will never be a compliment. The emperor, kneeling, watched as Vishnahel called the Duke into another room to resolve the matter there personally. The unfortunate father suddenly began to swear at Vishu, but they immediately grabbed him and covered his mouth with a hand so that he would not allow himself to go too far. Vishnahel plopped down on the throne and ordered Borov to fall prostrate before Her Highness. The man obediently agreed. The princess, seeing how he obeyed, asked in surprise why he obeyed her orders at all. The Duke raised his head and asked why Vishnahel was asking him about this at all. She, clutching her head, reminded him that he had promised to commit suicide and did not understand at all why he was getting involved in this. The boar named the number 16 and asked if the princess would believe that he had gone back 16 years. Vishnahel, who was sitting on the throne, asked that he also returned from the past using time magic. The boar smiled and said that he knew word for word what the little princess would answer him. The princess realized that she had said too much and began waving her hands and saying that Borov had misunderstood everything. The Duke began to tell how he met his god, and he revealed that he had fallen to a lower rank when he helped Kisamalos turn back time. He was worried that if something like this had happened to his god Chiron, it was scary to even think about what had happened to Kisamalos. Vishnahel, having heard this story, fell a little out of reality and began to think about the gods and their history. The Duke continued to talk about his god Chiron and the restoration of his powers, and in the end asked how it all went for the princess. Vishnakal shared that the day was like a broken record, repeating the same series of tortures. Sitting more comfortably, she asked Borov if he remembered their meeting, other than the one in the political prison. The Duke thought for a moment and replied that the princess behaved like a teddy bear, but was as perceptive as a demon. He said that he had no memories of his past life, although his god told him otherwise. Princess Vishnahel jumped from her throne when she heard that Borov was responsible for the death of the last heir of Kisamalos. The Duke, receiving blows and screaming about how damn painful it was, apologized to the little girl. He reminded that Her Highness the Princess needs her own people who will help her repay the debt over the next 16 years. Vishnakal did not believe that he was doing all this out of pure enthusiasm and asked about his sincere intentions. The Duke said that the power of his god grows only if he raises the child correctly. Vishnahel didn't like that Borov wanted to use her and tried to pull out his hair while sitting on his shoulders. The Duke looked at the little princess and explained that this was partly true, but he would not admit this fact. Vishnahel suddenly felt a sick feeling in her stomach and said that she would leave because she didn't want to endure it. In the restroom, the little princess was having a real brainstorming session. She thought that a psycho was the best option. Returning to Borov, she pointed her finger at him and said that he had an impudent face. He thanked her for the compliment. Vishnahel called the Duke a blockhead and, informing him that it was not a compliment, called him back to the throne room. The little one entered the hall and, waving to Borov's cousin, informed everyone that they had returned from the meeting. The red-haired aunt immediately asked Vishnahel how their personal conversation had gone. The princess jumped onto the throne with her feet and ordered her boar to kneel before her. The Duke obediently knelt before Vishnahel and, closing his eyes, began to wait. She looked down at him, putting her hands on her hips. Placing her hand on Borov's head, she began to say that Vishnahel Lorovi Kisamalos proclaimed him his father. The Duke, hearing this, took Vishnahel in his arms and said that he now obeyed her orders and also acquired guardianship. The boar, holding the little princess in his arm, vowed to return the throne to the princess on the day she came of age. The emperor shouted after his daughter, not understanding why she had treated him this way, and the guards had to take him to the country palace. Vishnahel, sitting in Borov's arms, looked at him and thought that they were taking him away because he still didn't understand anything. The Duke informed his new daughter that this was only the beginning of their long journey together. Vishnahel looked at Borov and told him to stop chatting and ordered him to announce it to everyone. The aunt and the Duke's cousin smiled and prepared to listen to the announcement. The princess also prepared herself and heard that Endekiron was installed as the new emperor by the rightful heir of Kisamalos. Raising his hand, the new emperor declared the beginning of the first year of the Enda era. The person responsible for the documents wrote an agreement between Vishnahel and the Duke regarding her accession to power upon reaching adulthood. A document was also drawn up accusing the former emperor of being incompetent and guilty of the death of the empress, and he was also sentenced to death. Vishnahel ordered it to be recorded that the seizure of the palace was her initiative in order to protect her Borov from responsibility. The man entered the hall and announced that all the ministers were assembled, and the emperor had ordered that they be invited to him. Upon entering the hall, people were shocked by the events taking place and did not understand how to react to what was happening. They saw the Duke sitting on the throne, and on his lap was a large pillow with a little princess. Vishnahel explained that if they did not contradict her, then everyone would be alive, and asked those who did not agree with her ascension to raise their hands. Borov confirmed the princess's words, and running his thumb across his throat, promised to finish off the traitors personally. One of the ministers asked Borov what Her Highness Princess Vishnahel had to do with it. The Duke explained that the little princess was under his protection and had something else to announce to everyone. Her Highness Princess Vishnahel must report the exact date and time of the former emperor's execution. People began to whisper that this was cruel, and they worried that she would one day become empress, and they were also afraid of Borov. The princess smiled mischievously and announced that she simply wanted to burn her father at the stake. She went crazy and said that she had to do this in order to avenge her late mother. An old woman who was a chamberlain hissed from the hall and called Vishnahel a merciless witch. The old woman closed her eyes, laughed, and asked how she could say such vile words to Her Highness. The princess heard how they were being insolent towards her and promised to remember that she would remember it for all 13 years, which angered the old woman. Borov didn't like the old woman's behavior and suggested eliminating her, but Visha stood up for her, saying that she was doing her job well. Princess Vishnahel, hearing the Duke's approval, reminded him that they were bound by fate and proudly clenched her fist. The boar, hearing how happy the princess was that they would walk this path together, again thought about something strange. Vishnahel desperately tried to cover her head with a pillow to block out the noise that was keeping her awake, and threatened to hit the person making the noise on the top of the head. Suddenly, she heard herself being praised for getting closer to Chiron, and in horror she jumped up from the bed and saw her golden-haired one. Kisomalos revealed that through their father-daughter bond, he had increased his divine power and could now materialize and help while nearby. Vishnahel looked at him with her mouth open, asking if it was really her golden-haired god standing before her. Kisomalos placed his hands on his hips and explained with a serious face that he had poured power into her dream to convey this message. The princess asked God not to start lecturing her because she had never received such messages. Vishnahel scratched her head and asked why the strength had returned because of the father-daughter bond, and not because of her dissolute life. Kisomalos called her a fool and said that she shouldn't be lazy, but rather needed to gather allies around her, then her divine power would increase. The golden-haired man was dissatisfied with the princess's question about 100 fathers and was indignant that he was getting wayward heirs. Raising his finger, he told the princess that bonds are not only formed between a daughter and a father. He explained that family affection, love, loyalty of friends, and even the devotion of vassals are also bonds. He folded his hands and made waves in the shape of a heart, saying that all of this was love. Vishnahel, sitting at her desk with a notebook, joyfully extended her hand and concluded that her father and God lost the throne because no one loved them. Kisomalos, having collected a small clot of energy in his hands, promised to tell the princess the fastest way to accumulate divine power. With his arms spread and a bright light radiating, he proudly shouted that it was necessary to have 100 lovers. Vishnahel, frightened, beat her chest with her fist and said that she would have only one husband, and they would live in peace and harmony, but God said that it does not work that way and it is not for her to decide. He said that although his grandparents were married only once, they had countless lovers. Vishnahel, having seen all this, vowed not to repeat it, and did not understand at all how there could be 100 lovers. Kisomalos, raising his finger, explained that simply saying a phrase about love does not mean taking on responsibility. Having received a portion of insults from Vishnahel, he insisted that this was still the fastest way, and she should receive a lot of love. The golden-haired man wanted to continue, but suddenly he began to bleat, and Vishnahel asked why this was happening. He held his head but could not say anything except me, and slowly dissolved into thin air. The little princess ran after him and asked him to stay after all the nasty things he had said to her. Vishnahel was already lying on her warm bed, and her room was illuminated by the morning light. She hoped that it was just a dream. The weather was fine outside, and the little princess was taking a walk, accompanied by her maid Emily. Because of yesterday's events, everyone was alarmed, and 3 rows of guards stood outside the princess's chambers. A man whom Vishnahel had never seen approached her and asked, coughing, for her highness. The man bowed, placing his hand, and stated that they were knights of the House of Chiron. He explained that the palace was under attack by the troops of the deposed emperor, and they would defend the princess's palace until safety was guaranteed. The knight proudly said that it was an honor to guard her imperial majesty, and the princess sleepily patted him on the leg and praised him. Vishnahel asked the knight since when they began to attract the attention of the rams, to which the knight said that the duke was not so bad. She continued asking who had brought the golden ram into the palace that would not shut up. The maid explained that he had appeared there in the morning and had not stopped talking, and the knight remarked that this was a good sign for Kisomalos. Vishnahel laughed and asked if it was a good sign that Chiron and not Kisomalos had ascended to the throne. The knight, believing that he had insulted the princess by holding his sword to her throat, promised to atone for his sins, which frightened Emily. Vishnahel waved her hand, calming her subordinates, and informed them that it was just a joke, and asked for lamb for lunch. She ordered the soldier to catch the animal and sent the maid to the palace to call the head cook. The knight caught the animal by throwing a rope around its neck, and the princess said that he asked for it when he was yelling under the windows. Vishnahel explained that she was doing this only because the lamb would die sooner or later anyway, and there was no point in waiting. Emily, with sweat on her forehead, announced that she had brought the exclusive chef of the princess's imperial palace to the princess. The little princess held the ram by the rope and asked it not to move as she showed it to her chef. The cook took off his hat and, apologizing to the princess, said that the animal was old and not suitable for cooking. Vishnahel believed the cook and did not want to eat the tasteless food, and also thought that it was still not good to eat the symbol. The princess was upset, gave the rope to her knight, and asked him to throw the animal outside the palace. The ram brayed when he heard that as soon as he was let out of the gate, he would most likely be eaten or turned into sausage. Vishnahel was very hungry in the morning, decided to ask someone to cook her breakfast, and started calling her cook. Suddenly, a red-haired aunt appeared, running quickly and greeting her dear niece. Auntie, waving her arms, suggested to the dissatisfied Vishakhel that they have breakfast together and at the same time review the rules of etiquette. The little princess, folding her arms, refused her and sent her home to eat while she herself went to the dining room to dip bread into soup. Auntie, hearing about the soup, became nervous and reminded her that she had taught her last week. Visha explained that this is how wild children live. The redhead explained that only her father was a wild child, while her mother was well-mannered and had impeccable manners. Vishnahel smiled and said that if she was so dear to her, then she should go hang out in her tomb. The aunt didn't like her tone. She grabbed the princess and promised to give her 10 punishment kisses. In the distance, Borov's cousin appeared and announced that there was urgent news from His Majesty the Emperor. Vishnahel didn't understand why the guy was talking about some problems, smiling, and even with tears in his eyes. The Duke was furious with a sour face and asked that Princess Visha be brought to him immediately. The woman who lived in the Emperor's chambers tried to attack him, but failed miserably. Vishnahel felt disgusted that this country bumpkin was sleeping in that room, and she thought that he apparently had strong nerves. The cousin began to justify himself by saying that Borov probably didn't know about the rules, and that his aunt had promised to give him a lecture. Vishnahel laughed and suggested that they go through to look at this crumpled village face in the form of an emperor. When they arrived, they found Borov smoking a cigarette and looking at the woman tied up in front of him. The auntie, who was holding Vishu in her arms, covered her nose because of the smell of cigarettes, and the princess began to cough. The Duke began fiddling with his cigarette on the bed and asking how they proposed to punish the tied-up woman. Vishnahel was distracted from the topic, looking at the Duke and not understanding how it was possible to look so naturally like a scoundrel. According to palace law, illegitimate children should be killed, and favorites should be returned to their families. Vishnahel, looking at the woman, suggested that Borov could have been a pervert and crossed the line while she was sleeping. But then the woman screamed and called the Duke a useless impotent, which confirmed that he had not crossed the line. The cousin, hearing this, began to roll hysterically on the floor, laughing and repeating the word impotent over and over again. The Duke was outraged that Lady Larovi was raising the child, since she already knew the meaning of such a word as impotent. The aunt began to justify herself by saying that it was not her fault, and she had said the word impotent only 21 times in front of the child. The cousin, wiping away a tear from laughter, said that Borov is not impotent, but simply does not consider people to be people. Visha asked who he considers them to be then. The guy thought about it and, imagining images in his head, suggested that he considered them to be some kind of likeness of monkeys or pandas. Giving a thumbs up, he explained that they would find out for themselves after they had lived with the Duke for a while. Visha allowed her to be made a mistress if desired, but advised strangling her offspring just in case. The woman turned to Her Highness in fear and said that Trinity was not guilty, and such a low person as she could not cherish thoughts of betrayal. Vishnahel, seeing the woman's emotions, suggested castrating her instead of killing her, branding her as a rebel and throwing her away. The Duke wished to do as Visha said, but the Emperor's mistress, who was being carried by guards, continued to call him impotent. She also wished for all the Kisomoloses to rot, which upset Vishnahel because she only cursed their family. The cousin wiped the little princess's ears and advised Her Highness to ignore these nasty words. The red-haired auntie approached Borov hesitantly and, coughing to get his attention, tried to convey something to him. She said that she didn't like him before, but when he listened to Vishu, her opinion of him changed, and the Duke explained that he didn't do it for Lorovi's sake. Borov left, calling the Lorovis thick-headed, which angered the aunt who thought he was showing off. Vishakhel approached her aunt and explained to her that Borov simply didn't like the Lorovi family very much. The redhead scratched her head and couldn't remember when they had fought, but Visha assumed that it had been in past generations. The princess assumed that her grandmother was behind all this, but she knew that Lorovi and Kiran had not crossed paths. Remembering the image of Borov and his ancestor, she wondered why her grandmother had wanted to destroy Kiran. The Duke creaked his chair back and invited Aunt and Visha to the table set for breakfast. Somewhere in the distance, terrifying screams could be heard. The execution of the imperial group that had invaded the palace was taking place there. Vishnahel assessed Borov's stomach, which wanted to have breakfast before this bloody mess. The Duke, explaining that this was not a topic for discussion but information, said that he would change Visha's teachers. The aunt got furious and asked who he was to decide this, to which Borov retorted with the title of Emperor. Vishnahel, eating her breakfast with a spoon, shamed her aunt and asked her to calm down and sit at the table. The Duke, sipping tea, noticed that the Emperor's former tutor, the Chief Chamberlain, was positively glowing with enthusiasm. Remembering the scary image of the old woman and hearing that classes would start tomorrow, Visha dropped her fork in surprise. Vishnahel was confused by what she heard and showed no signs of life for several minutes. She tried to explain to Borov that the old woman had been unable to teach the idiot emperor, and she would certainly not be able to do so. The Duke ignored Visha's words and said that he had added imperial law, economics, and philosophy to her program. Auntie was nervous and did not understand how she would study such complex subjects without even knowing how to read. Borov looked at Vishnahel and asked the redhead how she was able to read Martin's Republican dialogues. The princess read something similar and then blamed the Duke for her imprisonment. This is the proof. Vishnahel slammed her fist on the table in frustration and admitted that she had made a mistake in thinking that she would never see him again. She realized that she had to act now, otherwise the old woman would not give her any leeway and would not let her slack off any longer. Vishnahel realized that there was only one way out to say that he reads picture books and pretend to be a fool. Borov, not appreciating Vishi's acting, announced that the meeting was over and he was going about his business. Princess Vishnahel, enraged, jumped up from her chair and attacked the departing Duke, who continued to ignore her. Borov, seeing the princess's attack, easily pulled his shoulder back and dodged, looking at the child flying past him. Hearing Vishnahel swear, he forbade Lorovi from appearing in the princess's palace for a whole week. The Duke ignored all other words from the ladies and calmly walked away on his important business. Vishnahel refused to accept reality until the very end and, hanging on Borov's leg, continued to scream. The new emperor, with Visha on his leg, opened the doors with both hands to spend his first day of state. Having thrown the little princess off his foot, he looked around his domain and was ready to begin. Entering the throne room, the emperor sat on the throne, and upon hearing that there were no reports, he decided to attend to personal matters, continuing to ignore the princess. The man with the sheet of paper apologized, looking at Visha lying on the floor, and said that the reports were still there. The little princess stubbornly continued to be capricious, crying and demanding to catch some butterfly. Vishnahel fought to the last, rolling on the floor and sobbing right under the emperor's throne on his first day of state. The princess found herself in her bed with a crumpled face, trying to remember why she was there at all. Vishnahel remembered how she had passed out right in the throne room, having failed to get a refusal to conduct the training. The little princess blamed everything on the damned people who had really tormented her. Visha was furious and punched herself because after so much effort, everything turned out to be useless. Suddenly, Vishakel was distracted and stopped her hysteria as she heard a man addressing her. The knight held a round aquarium with a beautiful butterfly in his hands and said that His Majesty the Emperor had given it to her. Visha was, of course, pleased and hid her smile, but she continued to be mean and say that she was simply being bribed. She looked with curiosity at the aquarium with flowers and a beautiful blue butterfly flying in it. Vishnahel asked the knight if the emperor himself had caught her personally for her. The man, placing his hand on his chest and bowing, confirmed this and said that the butterfly had been caught by the emperor in his greenhouse. Visha realized what personal matters Borov was talking about and was very happy as she looked at her new pet. The knight bowed good-naturedly to the princess once again and promised to convey to the emperor that Vishnahel was delighted with the gift. Visha jumped for joy and asked her maid Emily to bring her some colored paper and a pen. The princess decided to demonstrate her origami technique and wrote a letter in which she once again asked to cancel the lessons. Carefully folding the letter and origami into the shape of a beautiful butterfly, she ordered Emily to take it to His Majesty. The maid, noticing the beauty of the butterfly, suggested placing the emperor's gift next to Vishi's bed. The little princess looked closely at the insect again, and putting her finger to her chin, began to think. Having told the maid that the butterfly was quite disgusting up close and that it would be cramped in the aquarium, she asked to let it out and jumped off the bed. Landing on the floor, she told the servant that she wanted to go outside and ride her bicycle. The maid was glad that Vishakel was finally behaving like a child and not trying to keep up appearances. All this time, Visha desperately wanted to play and have fun, but she restrained herself, devoting time to her studies. Every time the maids wanted to help her, Vishnahel refused for the sake of preserving her dignity. The maids felt sorry for the princess, but they could do nothing without their master's order. Emily thought it was presumptuous to think that way, but she wished the little princess as much happiness as possible. She recalled how hard Vishnahel had been through one of the dark incidents. The maids knew that the first Emily was alive when Her Highness was very young. Emily's maid was the chief and also the trusted confidant of Her Majesty the Empress. Little Princess Vishnahel trusted her maid Emily more than anyone else in the palace. Unfortunately, disaster was inevitable, as Emily, who often accompanied the Empress, attracted the attention of the Emperor. After the death of the Empress, the Emperor ordered her to appear in her chambers, but the maid dared to disobey the order. Because of this, the Emperor became furious and ordered the maid to be severely beaten for her disobedience. Eventually, the wounds from the Emperor's furious beatings were too severe and became inflamed. Unfortunately, Emily's maid couldn't take it anymore and died from her injuries. Emily's death struck Her Highness the Princess with devastating force. Even after a long time, the memory of this event chilled the blood of the maids. Little Princess Vishnahel sobbed uncontrollably from the loss until she began to convulse. The maid recalled how the princess fainted and remained unconscious for 2 whole days. When Vishnahel woke up, the maid began to tell her about Emily's funeral as quickly as possible. The little princess, hearing this, did not understand what the maid was talking about because she had forgotten about Emily's existence. From that day on, Visha began to call every maid working in the princess's palace Emily. Oddly enough, in recent days Vishnahel has begun to change, throwing tantrums and frolicking like a real child. Lately, her speech has become quite rude, and she can even call the servant a brat. The maid proudly raised her fist and vowed to serve Her Majesty the Princess no matter what. Every morning the maids rose with thoughts of Her Highness and trained their bodies with hundreds of grateful blows. The maids tried to express their devotion to Her Highness with every fiber of their being and delighted those around them with this. They took out the most luxurious goods straight from the royal treasury for their little mistress. The maids set themselves the goal of becoming the most outstanding ladies-in-waiting, worthy of Her Majesty. After a fun bike ride, Vishnakal sat down on a step with a bottle of water and rested. She thought that there was nothing better than a glass of cold water after a good sweat. The knight and his maid Emily admired how incredibly and impressively Her Majesty drank water. Vishnahel was very pleased with herself and the exceptionally busy day she loved being a princess. Suddenly, a scary old woman crept up to the little princess and asked if she had fully enjoyed her freedom. The chamberlain informed Vishakhel that screaming as if she had seen a monster was the height of bad manners. The little princess quickly realized that if the old woman caught her now, she would have to learn, and began to run away on her bicycle. The chamberlain immediately snapped her finger and summoned the servants who had jumped out from behind her and set off in pursuit. The servants immediately caught the princess and, taking her and her bicycle in their arms, carried her to the old woman for training. The chamberlain said that today they would undergo testing and tomorrow they would begin the curriculum. Vishnakal called her names and pointed out her wrinkles, and the old woman, laughing, said that for her age this was normal. The servants put the princess's bicycle on the ground, and she said that this was not an old woman, but a monster. Vishnahel circled the chamberlain and screamed incessantly, not even noticing that she was in a classroom. The old woman, her eyes flashing, said that if the princess passed the test with 100 points, she would be exempt from classes. The little princess was serious, and asked the teacher when the test would start, and she remarked that it was pleasant to talk to her. The old woman handed the princess a test and informed her that the test would last an hour and that all the questions would be either short answer or multiple choice. Vishnakal was confident in her abilities and knew that she had already completed the course and was ready for the questions for 5-year-olds. The little princess looked at the mathematical analysis and questions in the imperial dialect for her. It was like 2 fingers on the pavement. Visha confidently raised her pen with the dough and announced that she had finished the work. The old woman noted that she had completed it in half an hour. The teacher asked if Her Majesty was sure that the work had been completed correctly, to which Visha handed over the sheet again. Watching the old chamberlain take the test, Vishnahel was already anticipating how she would fail in her trap. The little princess was already dancing with her maid and planning how she would have fun in the near future. The old woman carefully studied the test completed by Visha and, clutching the sheet of paper, nervously muttered that she understood everything. She smiled and said that at first she didn't understand the emperor's idea, but after seeing the work, everything fell into place. Vishnahel was already rejoicing in her victory, pointing her finger at the teacher and ordering her to get lost far away into the fog. The old woman smiled at the princess and said that she would be happy to leave the classroom to prepare material for tomorrow. Vishakhel did not understand why she heard such an answer when she received the highest score, to which the old woman replied that it was only necessary to get 100. The chamberlain, pointing her finger at the test sheet, explained that Her Highness had scored 101 and failed it. Visha, having looked at the test again, was dissatisfied and accused it of deception and falsification. The old woman laughed evilly at the princess and said that she had been caught in the same way as her close relative. Her Highness was furious and threatened to cut off her head, to which the old woman only laughed, since she was under the protection of the emperor. From the room where the test was taking place, a cry of hatred for learning rang out throughout the palace grounds. Vishnahel had no intention of giving up and, having packed her things together with the maid, decided to run away before the end of classes. Slowly creeping forward, she thought she would outsmart the old woman and arrange an extracurricular activity for herself. Suddenly Vishnahel stopped, hearing the rather familiar sound of a bleating ram. The maid and Her Majesty froze when they saw the familiar animal they encountered on their way. The golden-haired ram, his eyes red with rage, looked with displeasure at the princess who had thrown him out. Visha, her mouth open in horror, could not understand how this damn ram had managed to get into the palace again. The ram shook his head frantically, stamped his feet and bleated, trying to communicate something to Her Highness. Vishnahel begged the animal to stop squealing and kicking, so as not to wake up all the inhabitants of the palace. The golden-haired ram jumped nimbly and landed with his hooves on a huge red ball. The little princess continued to be amazed by the animal and, clutching her bag, tried to remember. A picture appeared before her eyes of herself, accompanied by Emily, watching how skillfully the clown performed such tricks. Continuing to watch as the unusual ram continued to balance on the ball, she concluded that it had been training for a long time. The princess told the maid that it was none of her business and ordered her to continue escaping from the palace. The ram with golden wool deftly jumped off the ball and quickly ran after the fleeing princess. He grabbed Her Highness's dress with his teeth and listened to her tell him that he would be allowed to go to the barbecue if he did not let her go. The dress tore, and the lamb sadly fell down with a rag in its mouth, and Visha called it crazy. The animal bleated with tears in its eyes, looking at the princess running away with her maid. Her Highness and her maid sat comfortably under a blanket near a tree and enjoyed their drink. Vishnahel decided to take a long, good nap and then head out for a delicious lunch. Unfortunately, the plans were not destined to come true, as the loud word "attention" was heard in the air. Lady Loravi decided to use a billion-dollar explosion and asked everyone around to wear dark glasses to protect their eyes. The maid and Visha put the bottles to their eyes and decided to look at the explosion, which had never been used outside of combat. Her Highness suggested that her aunt had most likely found a common language with His Majesty the Emperor. Vishnahel raised her finger and, imagining, decided to explain what was happening to those who were not yet aware of the situation. From the very day that the idiot emperor was thrown out to the palace, types began flocking in, eager to start a massacre. The leader of these bloodthirsty thugs was a man named Zephyros, one of the three powers of the empire. Their faction is loyal to the Kasamalos line and will not tolerate Endakiron taking the throne without blood ties to the princess's line. That is why Zephyros decided that it would be right to put the legitimate heir of the Kasamalos on the throne. At this point, Auntie's use of the billion-dollar explosion means that she has sided with the Kirons. This fact is nothing more than a reflection of Endakiron's will that the princess should not be involved in his political maze. Aunt Loravi's ability is a clear indication of her readiness to engage in aggression. Everyone who knows about this ability of the aunt is afraid to enter into conflicts. Having settled comfortably under the blanket and holding the bottles to their eyes, the girls began to await the performance. A huge warhead was heading straight for the palace gates, ready to blow them to smithereens. The little princess and Emily admired Aunt Loravi's incredible strength. Vishnakel liked the fact that the emperor was still Borov, and it was he who would have to deal with all the problems. The little princess hoped that if Zephyros saw such power, he would immediately retreat, fearing for his life. Vishnahel was more concerned about those who had adopted a neutral stance, even after serving the emperor for years. Her Highness and her maid were very surprised to see in front of them that same lamb who had come to bother them again. The animal was very disheveled and tired and bleated at the girls very sadly, as if asking for help. Visha didn't like the lamb's appearance and asked the maid to take her to the nearest tree. While the maid carefully packed the things and folded the blanket, Visha tried to understand what the lamb wanted. After looking at him carefully, she said that he looked pathetic, but it was none of her business, and went for the maid. In the body of this lamb was a golden-haired god who did not understand how his descendant had not yet figured it out. Vishnahel walked with a huge portion of food and was surprised at how tasty it was due to her absences. Her Highness the Princess gobbled up a whole bucket of dessert. It's a good thing her aunt didn't see, otherwise she would have had a heart attack. After a small snack, the princess took another bucket and, accompanied by Emily, went up the mountain. On the way, she was met by a stocky man with pink hair and books in his hands, who remarked on how good the princess looked. Vishnahel, seeing him, stopped, and it seemed to dawn on her that she had already seen a similar man somewhere. Pointing her finger at him, she said that this was Zephyr, the brother of the corrupt pig who was sitting in the cell opposite. The man laughed and thanked the princess for remembering the nickname, but introduced himself as Tarquinius Krishna. Her Highness tried to pronounce such a difficult name, but realized that Zephyr would be shorter and much better. Zephyr said that the emperor pardoned him and released him from the dark cell where he was sitting. Vishnahel noticed that he had a lot of goods in his hands, and Zephyr said that it was for his new job. The old woman ordered him to supervise the lessons of Her Majesty the Princess, which greatly frightened Visha. Grabbing her ice cream, she immediately started running away, remembering how they had recently shared stewed meat, and now they were on different barricades. Zephyr smiled slyly and asked Her Highness to listen to him carefully. He laughed and said that if Vishnaka left now, he would miss a very unusual and incredible item. Her Majesty's curiosity got the better of her, and she began to wonder what Zephyr was telling her. Zephyr and Vishnahel locked eyes and considered their next move. The little princess changed her kind look to a serious one and realized that this day had come. She knew that even though the pink one looked simple, he was really not to be trifled with. Before Borov became emperor, there was a time when he extorted bribes from ministers under the pretext of punishment, and the strategist who handed the royal decrees to Vishnahel was none other than Zephyr. He was quite the type, and if necessary, he would not spare even his own brother for his own benefit. Visha decided that before he blurted out anything unnecessary, she should finish him off with the Kisomalos technique, hitting him on the crown of the head with a spoon. Zephyr, seeing this, assessed his chances and took out an incomprehensible item from his box for Her Highness. Having blown into the tube, the green ball rose into the air, and to the playful tada, Vishnahel jumped and was very surprised. The cunning Zephyr took out 3 cards and offered to play a game. If Vish wins, he will receive a pipe, and if he loses, he will refuse lessons. The little princess's eyes lit up and she immediately agreed, then asked what she wanted to play. It was all simple, you just had to turn over the cards and look for pairs, but Visha was worried that Zephyr would be smarter. Her Highness, citing her age, asked that she turn the cards over twice. Zephyr smiled sweetly, agreed to give the princess a head start and offered to choose a place for the game. Vishakhel was very pleased with these conditions, and jumping with joy, ordered the servants to prepare the bedroom for the game. The princess sat dissatisfied, folding her hands and blowing into her new tube, raising the balloon. Zephyr was cunning and dragged the little princess to history class and chattered for 2 whole hours. Every time the card matched or not, he would begin to lecture on some historical fact. Borov sat at the table with Vishnakel, reading a book and drinking tea and talking about the wonderful weather. Chaco laughed and told the Duke that if he continued to fool around, the princess would really go crazy. Hearing Her Highness's rude reply, Borov slammed the book shut and asked if she had picked up such manners from Larovi. Visha looked at the Duke with a sly look and squeezed the pipe in her mouth, saying that she was learning from a jerk like him. Princess Vishnahel continued to be mischievous and, continuing to look at the boar, blew into her pipe. The Duke, seeing this, said that even if the late Empress smoked a pipe, the princess should not adopt her habit. Vishnakal, turning on the old man mode, said that an adult should be more reasonable, and he asked why she called him. Her Highness the Princess rolled her eyes and said that no reason was needed for a father and daughter to meet, but the Duke didn't believe her. Vishnahel started screaming at him to cancel all her classes, but he turned away and started ignoring her. Turning around, he said that she only studied 2 hours a day, and that one day he would have to hand over the throne to her. Vishnakal did not want to become empress and demanded that Borov destroy the country before her arrival. He asked how. Borova, for the record, said that he was not interested in alcohol, drugs, or women. Then Visha asked about the war. The Duke, folding his fingers and asking her again about the war, thought for a moment. Her Highness the Princess said that if expansion continued for a long time, the country would collapse. Borov continued the conversation, telling about the constantly expanding country. The boar's eyes flashed as he looked closely at the princess, noting that she definitely had a thirst for war. He remembered how she had invited Bridget's sisters to dinner and spent an hour telling them about the capture of the fortress. The Duke, taking into account the princess's inclinations, suggested that she add military strategy to her lessons. Her Highness the Princess, hearing this, exploded in rage and pointing her finger began to scold the Emperor. The boar told the princess that he had some free time and suggested that they spend it together. He reported that Bridget's sisters had suggested they play house and explained the rules of the game. Princess Vishnahel herself had never played this game and had no idea what to answer Borov. She thought that if she played out this scene like in those pathetic plays from her past life, she would respond to him in the same coin. Vishnakel was already preparing her revenge and wanted Borov to regret inviting her to play. It dawned on Her Highness, and she pointed at herself and announced that she was now a father. Later, pointing her finger at the Emperor, she said that he was now fulfilling the role of a mother. Chaco was assigned the role of a daughter instead of a son, which greatly puzzled him. Emily addressed Your Highness and His Majesty and indicated that the playing field was ready. Vishnahel wanted to belittle the Emperor, making him feel humiliated, but he surprised Visha by saying that man and woman are equal. He crossed his legs and interrupted the princess, saying that he was not her servant and would not follow orders. Vishnahel was confused and didn't know what to do when she was asked why she should be met. The boar, showing all his menacingness and coldness, ordered the little girl to sit down nicely while he spoke. Visha was frightened, and it dawned on her that things would not be as she had imagined, but even the opposite. Without taking her eyes off the table, she tried to sit down at the same table and said hesitantly that she would earn money. Mama Borov said that she would too. He continued by saying that he had done everything from hiring servants to paying taxes to ensure a good life. Vishnakel, embarrassed, said that this was all true, but there were still people living here who did not feel the warmth. Borov retorted that if she wanted unconditional love, then she either needed to live with her parents or get a dog. Visha exploded and said that there was no point in trying then, and suggested that instead of running after her, they should get a dog. The emperor countered by saying that marriage is also a contract that is not based on pure love, and Vishnahel demanded a divorce. The cousin, seeing what was happening, took up arms and approached them, saying that he liked the way they were thinking. Taking his weapon from its sheath, he said that if people were not suited to each other, then it would be best for them to separate, and said that he would take her instead of her father. Hearing this speech, Borov stood up and said without emotion that the little rascal had finally shown his teeth. Chaco jumped forward to attack and told his mother that he had noticed the man much earlier. Borov dodged and asked how one could stoop to such lawlessness when it was one's father. Chaco explained that they had different blood in their veins and that Daddy initially fell in love with him. Borov, taking out his pistol, said that being loved by someone like him was a misfortune and he should be grateful to him. Vishnakal, observing this confrontation, came to the conclusion that this game was even worse and more disgusting than the plays. Watching these crazy people fight using real weapons, Visha was worried that someone might die. Her Majesty was frightened and ordered Borov and Choco to lay down their arms and stop the fight. The boys continued to fight with each other, and in the fury of the battle they did not hear the little princess at all. Vishnahel was very scared and started crying. She didn't understand why they continued to fight and didn't hear her. The old chamberlain's wife, seeing the men fighting, demanded with a menacing look that the fight be stopped. She was very unhappy and demanded that they explain what was happening. The tearful princess was very glad to see the headmaid, who asked how she was feeling. Gritting her teeth angrily, the old woman continued to demand answers as to why the princess was crying here and where the pogrom was coming from. Seeing the angry chamberlain, the emperor and his cousin, like guilty boys, sank to the ground and stopped fighting. The old woman accused them of drawing their weapons in front of Her Highness, which greatly frightened her. She reminded Borov that this had been his problem since childhood. He had not realized how much power he had, and he did not care. Vishnahel, hearing this, asked the old woman whether she had met His Majesty when he was a small child. The chamberlain ignored the question, putting Visha on the ground, and accused Borov of having read too much nonsense. Continuing to ignore the princess, she listened as Borov justified himself by naming the name of an authoritative author. The old woman stated that she had no connection with him and asked if the schedule for the coronation with Her Highness the Princess was ready. Borov looked guiltily at the chamberlain and informed her that the schedule was not yet ready. The old woman asked what they had been doing since they had found time to spend with the princess. Borov admitted that he had been playing house. The chamberlain felt ashamed of what she heard and decided that it would have been better to kill them in childhood. Borov remarked that this was too rude and asked if she would now cut their throats. Having hit Chaco on the knee, he stood up and said that he had promised Visha not to kill anyone, and that he had already grown up and become an adult. Vishnakel scratched her chin and concluded that the two had met in the past, but under what circumstances? The chamberlain, having listened to everything that Borov told her, closed her eyes and said that the schedule was already too tight. A special delegation from Astigais was already on its way. It was necessary to execute Helbatro and meet it the day after tomorrow. And after the execution, it is still necessary to hold the ceremony of His Majesty's ascension to the throne. The chamberlain announced that Her Highness the Princess was also obliged to attend the event, which did not suit Vishu. This was necessary to grant legitimacy to His Majesty, who had no right to the throne. The little princess folded her arms, turned away and said that children had no place in state affairs. The old woman was expecting this answer, so she said that the special guest at the event would be Gisperon himself. Vishnahel was overjoyed to learn that a young hero named Gisperon would be there. Because his mother was of low birth, he received neither a surname nor recognition from the imperial family. At the age of only 14, he went to the battlefield and won his first victory in combat. He did not stop there and continued to fight and suppress rebellions, but at the age of 20, he gave his life on the battlefield. Vishnahel was very impressed to learn that this particular guy would be coming to them. The old woman confirmed that it would be that upstart who knew nothing but war and whom Visha adored. The little princess calculated that if she was now 15 years old, then the young man must be about 15 or 16 years old. Holding out her fingers, Her Majesty continued to count correctly and understand how much there really was. Vishnakel was shocked and did not believe that she would ever be able to meet him in person. She began to fawn over the old woman so that she would help her meet the love of her life. Her Highness considered it her greatest trump card to say that the old woman's character was better than that of any mother-in-law. The old woman said that the princess did not know how to give compliments or lie, and it would be difficult for her to be empress. Having said that she did not want to be an emperor, the old woman replied that then she would not see her idol, which horrified Vishu. She no longer wanted to watch political reports with an IV drip. She needed to elevate Kisamalos and live happily ever after. Vishnakal grabbed the old woman and began to beg for a meeting, to which she asked him not to blow his nose into her skirt. Borov, putting his hand on his chest, declared that he too had fought since he was 15, and it was better to admire him. The old woman and Her Highness the Princess looked at him and asked what nonsense he was talking about. At one time, Borov was captured, and the previous emperor paid a large sum for his rescue, and Helbatro's mother destroyed all records of this. Borov listened to all the criticism directed at him and declared that the most important thing is the process itself, not the result. The chamberlain promised Visha a meeting with the bastard in exchange for her presence and good behavior. The boar called the old woman a hag, which made her angry, and kicking him, said that she dreamed of never seeing him again. Vishnakal, observing what was happening, came to the conclusion that the emperor was one of those who liked to get beaten. The old woman got tired of beating Borov and, putting her hands on her knees, decided to catch her breath and said that she was too old for this crap. She reminded the emperor that Helbatro's execution was scheduled for today and would take place in the afternoon, and that Her Highness needed to return to the palace. Since this is the execution of the father, it would be better not to be present there, so that all sorts of inappropriate rumors do not spread. Vishnakal did not agree with the old woman's decision and said that she also wanted to watch the execution. The old chamberlain called her a spiteful bitch, which did not please Her Highness the Princess. Visha explained that while this idiot would remain a good memory for her he was a piece of shit. Borov stood up for the princess and said that she had never been paid for her friendship with him, and it would be better for her not to interfere with comments. Vishnahel asked if they were really friends. The emperor explained that he did it for money. The princess said that even for money, she would not stoop to such friendship with a cretin. Borov said that money decides everything in this world, and he had no other choice, unfortunately. The old woman listened to this absurd dialogue and grabbed something wooden with her hands. She waved her hands upwards and with wild eyes accused Borov of filling Helbatro's head with all sorts of heresy. The emperor took the blow from the stool and defended the little princess, saying that it was unlikely to be him. Vishakel remembered that most likely the old woman was like a mother to his father, and most likely they really did go too far. She thought about it and came to the right decision that next time she would call her daddy names behind her back. The dark-haired guy with dark eyes and wearing blue clothes was named Ende Kiron. He was born into the ordinary ducal house of Kiron and grew up as ordinary as all children. Ende handled everything just as well as the others, and at the age of 9 he even mastered the stance of the highest knightly sword. He thought he had no problem expressing his emotions, although he was quite rude and did not understand that he could scare away the surrounding children with his words. Ende was confident that he could fit into any environment and was even proud of his ordinariness. Soon the boy's parents were killed. He cried a lot, and it seemed like the ground was slipping out from under his feet. The biggest blow for the boy was to find out who was responsible for the death of his father and mother. This was the work of his own uncle, who did not hesitate to come to the graves of the murdered. Upon learning this, Ende was beside himself and furiously angry, hating him more than anyone in the world. Despite these events, his childhood can hardly be called bad. He was brought to the palace and made a friend of the prince. He was brought to the palace by that same uncle. The prince greeted the guy rather rudely, saying that he didn't want to mess around with riffraff. Even in those years, Helbatro was known for his cruelty and ordered Ende to be flogged and imprisoned. Being next to the tyrant, he had to constantly endure bullying and humiliation, even without any particular reason. One day, it finally dawned on Ende why he had sold him to the palace of Prince Helbatro. Having put all the facts together, the boy decided that his uncle simply wanted him dead, but his plans did not come true. The uncle had seriously miscalculated, since the prince, although a fool, was nevertheless an extremely sensitive person. Helbatro was that strange individual who involuntarily became attached to those who remained close. Moreover, when Ende missed a day due to a deep wound, the prince personally came to visit him. The prince, embarrassed, said that he had brought him a magical healing stone because he was worried about his health. Watching him throw a stone at Ende, he concluded that the prince was as dumb as a cork. If he hadn't made fun of him, he wouldn't have had to spend money on the stone. The guy looked at him and realized that if he didn't take care of this idiot, he would definitely be finished. When Ende said this out loud, he got hit on the head by the angry prince, who demanded the stone back, but what was given was given. After this event, life in the palace became more pleasant, and they attended classes together. Helbatro eventually changed his attitude towards Endo, as he envied him for being so good at the disciplines. He tried his best, but was unable to break this distance, and eventually stopped talking to Ende. Unfortunately, it was these events that marked the beginning of the disaster. One day, Tanya Risto, already a chamberlain, came to Endo and begged him to return to his duchy. She asked for this because she thought that his presence brought the prince nothing but pain. It was just during these days that my uncle's order came to send me to war, and it was necessary to fight for my life every day. Unfortunately, even such an ordinary man was captured, and having resigned himself, was already waiting for the day of his death. But it turned out that Ende had powerful patrons who were able to ransom him from captivity. When he was released, there was a rumor that the prince had persuaded the emperor to pay a huge sum to ransom him from the enemy. Ende thought it was just a rumor, but nevertheless he managed to survive the war and escape from captivity. Upon reaching adulthood, he took the title of Duke and immediately executed his uncle's entire family. That day he was ruthless and wanted to execute his uncle's entire family, who could cause problems. But seeing himself in his cousin, he couldn't allow himself to kill him too. He was young, he had great potential, and if he wanted, he could even kill the Duke. Ende explained to his cousin that he was taking revenge on his uncle for his parents, but he was not going to kill him. The boy, hearing this, accepted the Duke's position and said that he had every reason to do so. Ende realized that, fortunately for him, his cousin was simpler than he thought, and it was easy to win him over to his side. During these purges, he killed many people, and since he was a man of conscience, he could not just sit back and live happily. He decided that he would carry out the duties of the Duke until his late brother's young son came of age. Shortly after these events, the emperor died, and Prince Helbatro took the imperial throne. Ende left his lands to his cousin and went to political prison. Rumors of the emperor's fall reached him. The rumors that he was a womanizer, a fool, and incompetent didn't frighten him, but the rumors about drugs worried him. Although the number of his atrocities was countless, he never touched drugs or anything like that. The Duke thought a lot about how he could get psychotropic drugs that were banned in the country. The only ones that came to mind were the Lorovi, who administered the drug during wars, and the emperor was married to the eldest daughter. The empress was already dead, but the question remained as to who else from Lorovi could have supplied the substance. Because of his promise to the chamberlain, he could not meet with the emperor, but then his daughter ended up in the next cell. The little princess had the same nasty character that Helbatro had had as a child. Upon learning of this, the Duke smiled and made a definite decision. He laughed to himself, stood up to his full height, and decided to talk to Helbatro's daughter. He punched the wall and made a hole, which frightened Her Little Highness the princess. And while in the next cell with the hole, he chatted with the little girl to get to know her better. She turned out to be funny and chatted a lot, telling about her dad, about the bed in prison and the hothouse strawberries. Endo laughed as he listened to her stories, realizing that she was even dumber than Helbatro had been as a child. One day she said she would be back soon, and the dumbass came with a broken cheek after visiting the senior dumbass. Endo immediately went to the palace to see Helbatro to teach him a lesson for raising his hand to a child. But his appearance, completely out of his mind, was pitiful. He thought that the late empress stood before him in male guise. Endo wanted him to pull himself together, so he beat him up so he wouldn't die and went back to his cell. That night a centaur appeared to him, who was the god of the Kiron clan. In general, by his nature, this god in the form of a centaur was quite gentle, but he had one habit when he was angry. He could appear at night and simply beat someone half to death. The first time this happened was when the Duke was expelled from the imperial palace, and the next time he beat Endo was when he took revenge by killing his own uncle. But this time the bearded Duke could not understand why this centaur decided to beat him again. Spitting out blood from his split lip, he asked the god who had appeared to him why he was beating him. Kiron looked at his descendant and said that he probably didn't realize that he had been sent back 16 years. In the future, because the Duke killed the last of the Kosomolos line, their god was forced to take a debt and turn back time. Luckily, he managed to pull off this trick, but now he lost his status and was in debt. Although Endo looked like a bear, he thought like a fox and noted that most likely the centaur helped with this. When he saw this happen, he shared his power, feeling responsible, and was demoted to the status of a deity. Endo destroyed the divine being who paid a huge price to turn back time. The centaur confirmed this and said that he must return the payment for this in exactly 16 years. He blamed Borov for all this and ordered him to bear responsibility for what he had done. Endo replied that he could not repent of what he did not remember, and if she was executed, then there was a reason for it. Chiron was angry that he only heard what he wanted to hear, while it was the girl sleeping behind the wall who was executed, and he ordered him to bear responsibility if he did not want to bear all the karma for what he had done. Endo suddenly woke up in a sweat, trying to figure out if he had dreamed it or if it had actually happened. He was very worried that the innocent little fool would grow up to be a piece of trash who would be executed in a cruel way. Covering the little princess with a blanket, Endo tried to figure out how to handle the child now. He watched Her Highness sleep and was touched by such a sweet little girl like her. Endo couldn't believe that she would grow up into a monster that could destroy the state. He came to the conclusion that, no matter how he looked at it, his suspicions fell only on the Lorovi family. Although Helbatro was a guy with a bad character, he was generally a good guy, but after communicating with Lorovi, he went bad. Helbatro, mired in drugs, was hopeless. The only way to save the Kisomalos family was to protect his baby. Endo unfortunately thought that his time of redemption would not end anytime soon. He promised his cousin to stay in prison until his nephew grew up and finished his studies. He felt sorry for the little girl, but he could not go back on his promise, and he had to turn away from her. Endo thought a lot about this decision and constantly regretted the choice he made. He was confident that he could raise her millions of thousands of times better than her father Helbatro. Looking at the baby, he thought that if she did grow up to be trash, there was no point in showing compassion to the princess. He was tormented by vague doubts he was touched by the princess, then remembered that she was Helbatro's daughter. As a result, he decided that he could cope with all the problems and raise her properly. While Ende was thinking about everything, the little girl did the incredible. She went and forgave him for all his sins. He called upon his god Chiron and said that the heiress of Kisomalos had forgiven him all his sins. Endo thought that since this little girl could forgive all sins so easily, she wasn't very smart. He decided that if she forgave his sins and allowed him to do whatever he wanted, then he would become her guardian. From that moment on, Endo was no longer held back by anything in the dungeon, and he knocked down the doors and decided to leave it. He immediately returned home and read every book on raising children he could find. At the same time, he began preparing troops to storm the imperial palace. As he had expected, the little princess agreed to accept him as her guardian, and thus began his life as an emperor. Since he was the only guardian, he had to give his all and tried very hard in the mother-daughter game. But unfortunately, something touched her, and the little princess began to cry loudly. And the old chamberlain's wife scolded them as if they were some little children. The baby's emotional development required a lot. She needed a pet and many good friends. The princess is also interested in war, so it's worth giving her a short tour of the battlefield. Endo was pleased with these events and promised to protect and guard Her Highness the Princess from now on. Vishnahel, holding the crown in her hands, announced that he now assumed the role of regent by virtue of his status as father and emperor. The princess placed the crown on Endo with her own hands to announce to the world that he was the rightful emperor. He, in turn, made a vow that he would be emperor only until the day the princess came of age. The reaction of others was disapproving, especially after the execution at the stake of the previous emperor. Before sending him to execution, she fed him a lot of painkillers, so as a daughter she did what she could. But for Vishnahel, the ceremony was now the most important event in her life. Most of all, she was looking forward to it finally ending for the sake of her future plans. Immediately after finishing, Her Highness the Princess found the old chamberlain and began to address her. When she saw her, she ran so fast that she almost knocked her down trying to stop. Making a very cute face, she asked if she had behaved well at this event, and she demanded praise for a job well done during the ceremony. The old woman was infuriated by all this cuteness. She cleared her throat and asked Vishnahel to stop doing this. She ordered the maid to contact the outer palace and inform the upstart of the meeting. Vishnahel, hearing that her idol was called an upstart, became furious and began to justify him. The old woman yelled at the little princess and sent her to her palace to wait for the meeting. Vishnahel ran so fast that her heels sparkled and was already anticipating meeting her idol. The maid informed Her Highness that Gisperon had arrived and the princess was already in seventh heaven. Before Her Highness stood a handsome young man with black eyes and dark hair. Vishnahel was convinced that he really was wearing all black, gloomy, and with murderous black eyes. She jumped towards the guy, thinking that his charisma was just bursting out, but he, seeing this, was confused. Unfortunately, Her Highness did not reach her idol and landed face down on the bedroom floor. Gisperon, seeing Her Highness fall, became frightened and asked if everything was all right with her. Vishnahel quickly rose to her feet and answered the dark youth that she was fine. She made a small bow and said that her name was Vishnahel and she was pleased to meet you. Making a funny face, the little princess realized that she had completely screwed up at their first meeting. Turning to Gisperon, she noticed that he had given her his handkerchief even when he saw her in such a pitiful state. She laughed sweetly, calling the guy sweet and kind, and asked him for an autograph. The boy began to feel shy and modest, and timidly replied that he was not the one who deserved the princess's admiration. Visha said that this was nonsense, but came to her senses in time and corrected him, saying that he was making a very funny joke. The maid entered the room and brought a health stone on a tray. The princess politely refused it. Vishnahel noticed that even just bringing a stone close to her caused the wounds to heal instantly. Gisperon lifted the sleeve of his shirt and, showing his bruised arm, said that the stone had been used on him. Her Highness asked if the idiot emperor had ever given out health stones to heal wounds. The guy was embarrassed to say anything bad about the emperor, pointing out his position. Vishnahel realized why the guy died at 20. They didn't give him stones and tortured him to death. Her Highness ordered Emily to bring a divine healing crystal for her guest. The servants informed the princess that the crystal was an unaffordable price for the princess's palace. Visha sat everyone down on the broth and ordered them to carry it. The next day, the princess was indeed served only broth, and she did not understand how to eat it. Emily fell on her knees and reported that the treasury was empty, and they each ate 3 small potatoes. Vishnahel spent her entire budget to buy a divine healing crystal. Hearing that there was nothing to eat now, Visha asked to be taken to her father as quickly as possible. The princess lay face down on the floor in front of His Majesty, and they were simply silent for a few seconds. The boar, watching what was happening, asked the little princess what she was doing. She said that this was her best bow and asked for a budget to be allocated for the princess's palace. The emperor knew that she had given the divine crystal and asked if she was the princess of Astyages. Vishnakel, making a sweet face, informed His Majesty that she was only his little daughter. He lightly kicked her and said how dare she call herself that, and Visha said that impudence is the second happiness. Having announced that he had demanded compensation for the damage to the Empress's palace after her former father, he could allocate a budget to her. Her Highness was very happy to hear such a generous response from the Emperor. The boar picked her up in his arms and said that there was only one condition for the little princess. He demanded that she attend all classes, and that part of the palace be converted into a classroom. Vishnahel also demanded a toy catalog, all the new items and a variety of options. The emperor, saying that one must strike while the iron is hot, decided to begin construction immediately. Vishnahel didn't believe they could do anything more than a little cosmetic work there. The little princess clutched her head and was horrified when she found herself in a fully prepared classroom. She saw some kind of round thing in the middle instead of high-class rosewood furniture. The boar said that these were good fittings, and the old ones could be given to friends. The princess did not understand what friends he was talking about. The emperor announced that he had solved the problem and that soon she would have friends for money, like Helbatro. He was worried that if Visha was alone, her social skills would deteriorate significantly. Borov said that he did not want a repeat of his father's story, and gathered together children who were weak in their studies but knew how to suck up. The princess latched onto the word of the weak in studies and took it as an insult. Suddenly, a ram with golden wool entered the room and began bleating loudly, tiring Vishnahel. He snatched up a stack of papers and bleated in his own language that talent needed to be hired as he had requested. The ram tore up the list of friends in front of Vishnahel and Borov, and the princess asked if animals get rabies. The emperor said that it was just a copy, and the original was in his office. He picked up the surviving sheet and offered Visha to look at the resume of one of the girls. She was a cat-like girl, 2 years older than Vishnahel, and the second child of the Achilles family. Seeing this summary, the little princess snapped her fingers in approval, and the lamb confirmed that this family was quite talented. The boar put a collar on the ram with golden wool and decided that a pet for Her Highness had been found. He handed the leash strap into the hands of the surprised princess and asked her to take good care of it. Smiling and winking at the princess, Borov asked Her Highness to think of a name for the pet. The boar had many state affairs to attend to, and he left, which enraged the little princess. Vishnahel just wanted to make friends and not look after the ram, while the green-haired girl studied Lorovi. The girl read that Vishnahel was the only legitimate heir who would plunge her into madness. The god in the body of a ram overturned a tray of grass because he wanted meat, and the maid scolded him for it. Visha didn't like her pet. She remembered the image of Borov and realized that he really irritated her and she couldn't stand him. When they played badminton, he outplayed Vishu and left. The same thing happened with the card game. Borov beat Vishnakal at board games and even at the simplest game of spinning tops and always got away. Her Highness was upset that her guardian could not give in to the child even once in his life. Emily's maid opened the doors and informed Her Highness Vishnachel that Achilles had arrived. The little princess asked her maid to take her to meet her mean and spineless friend. With her arms spread and a wide smile, Vishnahel greeted the young lady Achilles. After greeting Her Highness, she asked to be called Sally and, bowing, spoke of the golden ram and her respect for the princess. Vishnahel did not expect such an acquaintance and was a little confused, as she had imagined everything differently. Visha asked if she was tired from the journey, to which Sally replied that she had neither a soul nor a future, and was ready to obey completely. Vishnahel reported that His Highness had ordered a room to be prepared for the princess's friend. Sally, seeing how many books there were in her room, was overjoyed and asked if she could read them all. Visha was taken aback by her friend's reaction and decided that she had made a mistake in her choice, but she allowed her to read it. The girl, taking one of the books, thanked the princess very much, since she was forbidden to read more than her brother because she was a girl. She walked around like a maniac, stroking the shelves of books, saying how happy she was that she would be able to study. Vishakel was very scared when she saw what her new friend was doing and didn't know what to do next. Sally's madness did not subside, and she jumped like a madwoman towards Her Majesty, screaming that she loved her. The little princess became frightened and began to run away in tears, calling for help from her maid Emily. The next day, young Achilles was shocked that she too could attend classes with the princess. Vishnakal looked at her as if she were crazy and, having given her the papers, ordered her to do her homework for her. Sally hugged the tasks and thanked Her Highness, saying that she loved her and would not go anywhere. The little princess was terrified of her new friend and wanted to find the boar to send her home. Previously, the emperor often played with the princess until he slipped her the dream of psychiatrists and often disappears to meetings. It was already December, and the princess still hadn't managed to find Borov to get rid of her friend. Zephyr, seeing the princess, asked why she was sleeping and inquired about her well-being. Sadly buried in her book, she told him that her new girlfriend was driving her crazy and that Borov didn't want to see her. Zephyr reminded that tomorrow was Her Highness's birthday, and the emperor was most likely busy preparing gifts. Vishnahel thought about this and hoped that after her father changed, they would throw a small party. The birthday arrived, and the surprised little princess, with her mouth open, was reflected in her father's black glasses. The boar, stylishly dressed in all black, congratulated the little girl and said that he had prepared the fortress of Laruris for her. Vishnahel didn't expect this and thought that he had come back again to talk some nonsense. She couldn't believe that he had actually managed to capture such a powerful fortress. This fortress was a very big headache, and it was precisely about this that the discussion with Bridget's sisters took place. Achilles cried out in surprise that there were more than 500 people in the fortress and asked her father how he managed it. Borov asked to be addressed as His Majesty and did not understand why she called him father. The cousin furiously attacked the emperor, asking him to die, but he easily repelled this attack with the barrel of a pistol. The guy accused him of making the job too difficult and was also unhappy that he had ruined a very expensive sword. Borov accepted all of his relatives' grievances and offered to buy him a dozen of these swords. The princess interrupted the squabble and asked not to change the topic, but to tell about the capture of the fortress. Chaco said that he went around her from the unprotected side and single-handedly cut down all the enemies with his sword. Scratching his nose, he said that when he had solved more than 800, he thought he was finished, but there was a monster living next to him. Borov said that he did everything according to the law and notified the fortress about the capture so that everything was done according to the law. Vishnakal heard one of the servants inform Borov that Medea's troops were approaching the palace. The emperor did not like this, as he had asked to let only their king through and to chop up all the rest. Sally, her eyes shining, offered to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball to her father. He asked to address her as Your Highness. Borov saw how Achilles wanted to show off her abilities and decided to give her a chance. Vishnakel, taking the opportunity, whispered that her new friend was crazy and asked to send her home. Seeing that Borov had completely ignored her request, she called him a goat and remarked that he was turning a deaf ear to everything. Sally was really smart and calculated the trajectory accurately, but she didn't take into account that the king was riding in an armored car. The king who was in it was furious, but he was glad that he had finally managed to get into the palace. The soldiers surrounded the car and grabbed him. He demanded that they take their hands off because he was still the king. The king was bound and kneeling before the emperor and Her Highness the princess. The boar, turning to the king, was sure that he was already prepared for the fact that the heir to Medea's throne would be his prisoner. Vishnakal, hearing this, concluded that if they had captured the legitimate heir, they would be able to dictate terms. The princess, not having heard even a word about revenge, suspected something and called the tied-up king a weakling. Medea had 3 legitimate heirs, and before Borov and Her Highness there was a girl in a wheelchair. Vishnakal, pointing her finger and calling the man a dystrophic, did not believe that the man in front of her was a prince and thought that they were being deceived. Putting his hand to his chest, he objected that she was not a girl, but a prince, and his name was Croa Geda Medea. Visha didn't understand how one could name a child her petit croissant, but the prince corrected her by saying that Gade was a curse, and not a croissant, but a Croa. The boar stopped Her Highness the princess and reported that he had heard about the vile custom of their country. The body of the one receiving Medea's power quickly declines, and the heir to the throne and the divine power are different people. Judging by the state of health of this young man, he is the one who accepted their divine power. Vishnahel, hearing this, called him scum, unfit for captivity, but the king objected that he was his son. She ordered the prince to stop crying and replied that if he really valued his son, he would have sent some fool. She apologized but still exploded furiously, again asking the prince to save face. The boar informed the surprised king that the prince would not be a prisoner, but would be under protection. It was as if the heir had asked for help because of his difficult life, and they saved him. It would be better for his image. The king was not against it, as he did not plan any conquests, and they were interested in seeing the reaction of other states. His Majesty also added that there were more than 200 treaties to sign, and presented them to the king. Only Chaco received a gift for the new year. The others didn't deserve it, and Borov received it with a hoof. Visha imagined the god Chiron as a horse. The countries approved of Borov's actions, and their country even began to live better. The medicine finally worked on Vishi's tongue, and she felt the tongue well. The princess decided to take a walk and saw a bunch of guards near one of the towers. Upon learning that Medea's prince was being guarded, she persistently asked to see him. Vishnakel was denied a visit, and as the heiress she was very surprised by the words of this sickly servant. Hearing that entry was only permitted with adults, Visha ordered Emily to rush like a bullet to the emperor for a pass. The emperor was driving a luxury car, and a frightened Chaco begged him not to drive at such a speed. The car stopped abruptly, and the cousin flew out of the car. Borov said that he should have buckled up, but he simply didn't have time. Vishnakel found Borov and introduced him as a cool, rich, psychopathic guy who only has money he didn't expect to see her. Her Highness told her father that caring for the captive prince was the true duty of a true heir. Borov sighed and asked if she was sure she hadn't come to humiliate and mock him like Helbatro. The emperor praised the princess's insight and explained that Medea's divine power was a curse and that anyone who used it would pay a corresponding price. Therefore, the throne and power are divided, and in order to use it, a sacrifice is needed, which is why he was tied up. But Borov watched the guy's behavior and even gave him a fork and knife. The prince heard Her Majesty scold the emperor for knocking and, hearing no answer, opening the door. He was as nimble as a cockroach and quickly crawled on his knees to the guests and asked what brought them to him. The boar told the boy that the princess of their country had come to him to mock and ridicule him. Visha said that this was not so and calmed the tearful prince, telling him that she just wanted to see how he lived. Borov, seeing how shy Vishnakel was, said that she was like a nerd on her first date. The princess shut him up and, proudly placing her hand on her chest, introduced herself as the noble princess of the House of Explosions, Laura V. The prince clapped for the princess, and she appreciated it, as she liked the adoring looks they were giving her. Visha liked this much more than the antics of her new friend from the Achilles family. She reminded Borov that her strength grew from her friends and lovers, and suggested that he make the prince her younger brother. The emperor explained that he would be something like a playmate, receiving scolding in her place and giving in to games. The prince refused because of his sore legs, but Visha, seeing how well he crawled, suggested that he would be able to walk, and Borov was also sure of this. He called the prince baby and, getting down on one knee, asked him to try and promise to catch him if he didn't succeed. The prince was in doubt when suddenly Chaco appeared with a broken head and shouted that it was great to be friends with the princess. The boy thought that he would never be able to walk again, but all these words encouraged him, and he decided to try. Borov once again asked the boy to gather his strength and try to reach him on his own 2 feet. The prince pushed himself off the chair and began to move on his feet towards the emperor who was waiting for him. After taking a couple of steps, he jumped on the emperor, who, as promised, stretched out his arms to catch the guy. Borov, seeing this, realized that the guy had a chance and promised to create a system of bench training for him. The prince, seeing how he was able to walk a couple of steps, could not believe what had happened. He had hope. Borov, with the princess nodding, said that until he turned 18, he could not use the curse. He promised to tell the details later, when he signs the accompanying contract. Vishnahel, who was sitting in the emperor's arms, listened to the dialogue, waved her hand to the prince and said goodbye. The prince was not used to such attention and, having fallen out of reality, simply looked at the princess. As soon as he came to his senses, he thanked the princess for her generosity in taking such a worthless man under her wing. Vishakhel shared with Borov that the guy was a sweetheart and would not cast curses, since he agreed to sign the contract. She noticed that such a friend would definitely raise her divine status, and hurried to the palace to prepare a room for him. Vishnahel walked to the palace humming a song with joy, and was happy that she had a new friend. Suddenly Sally appeared, which terribly frightened Princess Vishnahel, who was wondering where the princess was. Her Highness put on a serious face and warned Achilles that important information was about to be revealed. Having assessed the distance between the rooms, she told Sally that the princess's new friend would be living next to her. This news frightened Achilles greatly, and she asked the princess standing next to her again. Sally didn't like the fact that Her Highness wanted to bring another friend to the palace. She was furious and did not want to let anyone try to come between her and the little princess. Sally scared Vishnahel by climbing a column and promising to tear her new friend into small pieces. It took Kroa over a month to transport, firstly because of the frantic Achilles, who was being calmed down, and also because he had to catch up with them in his studies. Zephyr politely introduced his new student to his students and said that they would now study together. The guy began to introduce himself, saying how old he was and where he was from, that he was under the protection of the emperor. Realizing that this was most likely not very interesting to the princess and Achilles, he suddenly fell silent and said to call him Kroa. Sally looked at him like a villain, glad that the boy was only 10 years old, and initially thought that they were the same age. Croa, embarrassed and red-faced, justified his appearance by saying that he ate only 1 potato a day. Achilles was infuriated by this manner, as she believed that he was deliberately pretending to be pathetic in order to win the princess's favor. The guy put his hand on his cheek, saying that he was not pretending, but was really very pathetic. Sally was bursting with anger, asking if the ignorant weaklings always win in the world. Zephyr clapped and asked them to talk later, and Croa told Lady Visha that he was looking forward to being together. Vishnahel was very surprised by this address, but allowed the guy to call her Princess Visha. Her Highness explained this by saying that there should be no such thing as status between friends. These were also the words of her mother, who in fact had no friends for this very reason. Croa, hearing that he was called a friend, was delighted, and somehow his soul became warmer. The boy studied well and easily answered the difficult questions asked by Zephyr in class. He caught up with the entire program in a month, without any education, and Visha dozed and hoped that at least he would give in to the games. Vishnahel liked that she now had 2 friends who raised her divine rank status. But the noise doubled. Achilles suggested drinking a mojito during a game of chess, and Croa said that he learned to ride a bicycle and said that the princess prefers active recreation. Vishnahel assumed that he was doing the emperor's exercises well, since he was able to ride a bike. Sally, trying to pull the blanket over herself, manically holding onto the chessboard, asked to play a game one against everyone. Vishnahel was seething with the fact that each of her new friends was trying to get her attention. The princess got furious and gave them the opportunity to have fun together, thinking that with the increase in friends it was becoming too noisy. Everyone who saw the princess tried to win her over to their side, apparently. Seeing a child, they think that he is easy to manipulate. While Vishnahel could ignore the lower ranks, the elders of Zephyros were not part of the houses, and it was not possible to deal with them. Watching her friends beat each other up, Visha came to one remarkable conclusion. Achilles and Croa froze to listen to the information from Her Majesty the Princess. Vishnahel came up with an operation to change the balance of power and called it beat each other up. Sally instantly understood the terms and promised to beat the prince up, but he said it wasn't fair and was forbidden to cast curses. Vishnahel started waving her hands to stop them and said that she didn't mean them. Vishnahel, since no one was listening to her, took out her microphone and tapped it to get attention. The princess asked those present to allow her to present her plan called Ushatai All. At the moment, Zephyros and Lorovi were vying for the position of the princess's mentor, and Visha gave him the microphone for the presentation. She planned to pit the 2 houses against each other in order to weaken them and strengthen the emperor's power. The first point of this plan was to arrange a festive banquet in honor of Her Majesty the Princess. Vishnahel brings up the topic of mentoring, which causes friction between Lorovi and Zephyros. In the third point, they allow them to cling to each other and engage in a grueling fight. This was Her Highness's plan, but she was too lazy to bother with it herself, and she decided to pit them against each other. After bowing, Gal Tarquinius Krishna announced that he had helped with the presentation and thanked them for their attention. The boar, having familiarized himself with it, was delighted and, clapping his hands, said that he recognized his daughter and that this was truly a devilish plan. Vishakel scratched her head shyly, talking about the expenses that would go into hosting the banquet. Borov said that the Kirans did not belong to the elite of the imperial aristocracy and offered to tell how they managed to obtain the status of duke. Her Highness, her eyes glowing with gold, got ahead of the emperor, saying that they were damn rich. The old woman pointed her finger at Borov and said that there was no wealth there after he had squandered everything in gambling. Having said that these were investments, Vishnakel became furious, clarifying that only a madman would invest the budget in a new startup. The princess continued to scold him, asking whose money he had invested and that he wanted to lead the country into a crisis. Having caught the furious blow of Her Highness the Princess, Borov earnestly asked him to listen carefully. He explained that the Havilands were behind it. Even though they were using Carrier's name, it was a project that a lot of effort had been put into. Placing his hand on Visha's head, Borov said that this project was doomed to success. The princess heard a familiar name. Haviland was the third great house of the empire, but due to its autonomous territory, it is more of a partner than a vassal. Vishnakal remembered that they made a fortune on air conditioners. Did Borov really remember all of this? Her Highness asked about the enhancement he had received, but the Emperor said that he remembered nothing of the past. He explained that under the influence of the Kirans, everything flourishes, even the newest startups entering the market. Borov asked Visha not to worry about money from now on, but to focus on implementing his plan. A few weeks later, Princess Vishnahel and Emperor Kiran attended the imperial ball. Aunt Loravi, as soon as she saw her little princess, immediately ran to greet her, opening her arms to embrace her. Borov stopped his aunt, putting his hand on her forehead, and said that he did not know what harm she could do to the child. Seeing this, the idea came to him to teach Vishnahel self-defense, and he began to think about a martial arts teacher. Visha slapped the emperor, saying that they had not discussed such things and that they needed to follow the plan strictly. The aunt proudly raised her finger and announced that all the women in the family, generation after generation, had mastered the bayonet as a basic skill. Duchess Zephyros immediately ran up, pushing her aunt aside, and said that the little girl would not be able to hold a weapon and that she needed a hand-to-hand combat teacher. Vishnahel, listening to this conversation, was very scared when the conversation turned to the mixed martial art pankration. Auntie said that she would feel more comfortable among her own people and suggested finding a teacher for this martial art. Vishnahel nodded her head, but she was already waiting for these two bitches to beat each other to death. A real altercation broke out between the women, and they began to have a very aggressive discussion with each other. Vishnahel and Borov realized that it had already begun and were ready to watch them tear each other's throats out. Since the banquet, a shadow war has begun between the Zephyros and the Loravi. The Zephyros have been honestly trying to find a teacher. The aunt couldn't resist and decided to find the killers, remove the competitor, and get rid of the problems. Ultimately, the chosen teacher, who turned out to be a distant relative of Zephyros, was killed under mysterious circumstances. As a result, a real local war broke out between the aunt and the Duchess. Borov organized a joint walk to celebrate the completion of their brilliant plan. The emperor was very busy, and Visha thought it was very sweet that he was able to find some time for her. Her Highness said that Sally looked like a cute little detective, and Croa reminded her of a depressed priest. He didn't know whether to take it as a compliment or be upset. Vishnahel, putting her hands on her hips and closing her eyes, asked expectantly how she looked today. The maid and the princess's friends were delighted and shouted how good Her Highness looked. Having gathered, they moved towards His Highness, who was standing in a black leather jacket, leaning on the door of a white car. Vishnahel and Achilles enjoyed the beautiful alley in front of the Ministry of Finance. His Majesty the Emperor did his best for his guests, arranging a magnificent picnic in the open air. Vishnahel asked Borov why he had chosen such a noisy place for a picnic right next to the meeting room. The Emperor replied that he was waiting for the pigs to gather, and Visha imagined the grunting piglets. She told the confused Croa that piglets, when hungry, can eat anything. The guy remembered that the Kisamalos had a tradition of feeding prisoners to pigs, and he was worried. Vishnahel and Sally, hearing this, laughed until their stomachs hurt, and the princess explained that this was not true. The boar asked the old woman from whom she had picked up her cunningness, and she laughed and said that it was from him. Achilles, pointing at herself with her fingers, asked the emperor how she was similar to him, but he did not understand where the connection was at all. The old woman explained that she was similar when she skillfully pretended to be someone who did not understand anything. Kwa also became interested in how he was similar. The chamberlain said that he, like the emperor, is very tenacious wherever you throw him. He crawls back alive. A stocky man with pink hair and a mustache opened the window and had already said that he was starting the meeting. It was Zephyr's brother, who was the Minister of Finance, and he asked in fear what His Majesty was doing here. Borov looked at the minister and calmly replied that he had decided to organize a picnic at this place. Vishnahel, having heard the discussion between the minister and the emperor, realized that this was another social studies lesson, and Borov was obsessed with education. The Minister of Finance, realizing that he would not be able to convince the emperor, decided to begin his meeting. The guy pointed to the chart and said that the princess's palace budget was the same as it had been the previous month. Vishnahel, hearing this, said that with the appearance of the prince in her palace, the budget should be increased. The boy said that the princess's palace was spending its budget beyond its limits, and immediately received a scolding from His Highness. The boar put the princess in her place, reminding her that she was so infatuated with the foreign boy that she was ready to give up the foundation of the palace. The princess was embarrassed and could not answer, although she thought to herself that Gisperon was the best in the world. Borov told Visha that he was a good-natured father, and if she submitted a formal application with an explanation, he would consider the options. The princess warned the emperor that she would write him the most brilliant application he had ever seen. The chamberlain's wife politely asked Borov if he would like to discuss the matter of Astyages. He said that he had just wanted to say this, but the old woman knew that he would only remember in his office. Vishnahel, having heard about Astyages, asked whether this was the kingdom of her beloved Hesperon. Borov said that they were demanding his visit, since if the emperor had changed, he was required to appear and introduce himself. Astyages was a large kingdom that had conquered the north and was more influential, but Borov was worried that if he left the palace, a war for the throne would begin. Visha asked her father to send her to this kingdom and assign his cousin Choco to look after her. Borov was worried that Choco alone would not be enough, and that it would be better to attach a battalion of soldiers to them. Suddenly, a brilliant thought struck Her Highness, which knocked her out of reality. realizing that if she were to be in the empire where her idol lived, she would need to prepare a worthy gift. The boar, seeing the little princess rushing towards him, realized that she would again demand money from him. Having made angel eyes, Visha asked to send some money to her precious and only daughter. She used the excuse of maintaining her image and said that she would need a dress and all sorts of girly things. Borov agreed with her words and allocated 100 million to the princess for emergency image maintenance needs. To maintain his image, the emperor assigned the chief chamberlain, Mrs. Listo, also known as the chamberlain, to the princess. Vishnahel didn't like this and was sure she could handle it herself, but Borov said a guardian was needed. His Majesty announced that their little excursion was over and asked the princess to return to her palace. Her Highness continued to be hysterical, even though she understood that it would achieve nothing, and Borov had already decided everything long ago. After this, the team for the trip to the Empire was assembled. The participants were the hag, Choco, and a couple of ladies-in-waiting. An airship was also prepared for safety, and the Emperor and her friends came to see Visha off. It was touching, and the princess shed a tear, not even realizing what a disaster awaited her in the future. Upon arrival, Her Highness was very happy to feel the solid ground beneath her little feet. She had never flown in an airship before, and for 3 days all she did was vomit and sleep. The princess walked down the red carpet, but all she could think about was that if she had known, she would never have flown. The gray-haired young man, seeing this, cleared his throat a little and greeted the arriving princess with a warm smile. He wanted to hug the princess, but she continued to feel sick, and she, covering her mouth with her hands, asked him to get out of the way. Ignoring Her Majesty's words, he embraced Visha and announced that he was the 5th prince of Astyages. Vishnahel couldn't restrain herself and left a small gift right on the young prince's shoulder. The gray-haired prince was horrified to see a palette of rainbows and magical butterflies from the princess on his shoulder. Choco and the old chamberlain, seeing the incident, quickly ran to the princess, worried about her well-being. Vishnahel realized that the best way out of the situation would be to simply pretend to be unconscious. The hag scolded Her Highness for throwing up on the pure-blooded prince and didn't know how to resolve it. The chamberlain said that she had already bathed and changed the princess's clothes, and that she would soon have an audience with the emperor. Vishnakal asked why such an event was taking place upon arrival, and the old woman explained that they wanted to give everyone a chance to rest from the journey after the reception. Her Majesty cheered up, reporting that her seasickness had passed, and she was ready for the event. The clothes and buildings were very different from what they had been in Kisomalos, which surprised the princess greatly. The chamberlain reminded him how to behave with the emperor, namely, to answer briefly and simply. The old woman considered the princess unreliable, which angered her, often asking her again about the rules of conduct. Choco agreed with the chamberlain's words, but believed that Vishnahel was a sweetheart and would cope with the problems. Having collected her thoughts, Her Highness the Princess decided to prove to everyone that she was not stupid by demonstrating a master class. The size of the front doors, designed to intimidate foreigners, did not work on Vishu, and she was already standing in the throne room. Lifting the hem of her dress and bowing, the princess thanked the emperor for the invitation and introduced herself fully. The emperor looked at the ancestor of Kisamalos and approvingly declared to the princess that the radiance of the golden ram will come with you. Vishnahel knew the answer exactly and said, "May wisdom gain wings." The emperor greeted the princess and asked if it had been difficult for her to make such a difficult journey. Before he could hear the princess's answer, he interrupted her and asked her to answer another question. The emperor asked if it would still be a golden ram the next time they met. Vishnahel made it very clear that the new emperor was elevated to the throne only by her will. The emperor asked Her Highness if she was sure that she could take the throne at her own discretion. Vishnahel replied that she could do it without any problems and saw no reason to doubt it. The emperor assumed that the princess was tired from the journey and suggested that she rest, albeit a little, but in comfort. Vishnahel, along with Choco and the chamberlain, stood near the closed door to the throne room. The old woman praised Her Highness for having done her job so well. It was especially good that the princess did not talk much and did not reveal any of her weaknesses. Vishnahel laughed when the emperor, after saying, "Take a little rest," arranged 3 banquets in a row. The princess was introduced to all the important people, but she was unable to see her young hero named Gisperon. Vishnahel was worried that the young man was not invited because he was an illegitimate heir. Her Highness the Princess is upset by the fact that she will not be able to see the hero Gisperon. Suddenly, Vishnahel's sadness went away, and something surprised her greatly. In the corner stood a young man in blue robes. It was the young hero Lord Gisperon. The princess, holding her dress, quickly ran up to the guy, introduced herself and asked if he remembered her. The lord was very scared of the princess and asked her not to call him a young hero, which surprised the princess. He asked the princess to go away from the banquet hall and asked her to call him anything but that. The princess did not understand. Vishnahel was very happy to see him and remembered that she had prepared a special gift for her idol. Gisperon replied that it was not as great as she thought and that the previous gift had been too generous. Her Highness interrupted the guy, saying that he hadn't even unwrapped the gift yet, and he was already refusing it. The case contained a sword decoration, and although it was inexpensive, the stone promised to bring good luck. The princess told Gisperon that she had placed her wishes into him and hoped that good luck would accompany him and that he would not be harmed. The boy looked at the princess with warmth, pressing her gift to his chest, and said that he would accept it with gratitude. He was worried that someone would notice them together, and it would damage the princess's reputation, and asked her to come back, which upset Vishu. She thought about it and also began to worry about him, and Gisperon once again thanked her for her attention and care. Vishakel promised to look forward to their next meeting, and the guy walked away towards the palace. The princess was pleased with her visit, as she had talked with the emperor and seen her idol. The old woman saw that Vishnahel had nevertheless given a gift worth 10 million to a worthless person. This infuriated the princess, and she began to defend the boy. Visha was unhappy that the old woman did not say anything good, and the chamberlain invited her back to the ball. Chaco called the princess cutie, and the princess herself, seeing something, was very surprised and even cursed. The chamberlain noticed that the princess had become unnaturally quiet. She found this rather strange. Finding that Her Majesty was nowhere to be found, the old chamberlain began to shout throughout the area and call for Vishnakel. The carts with horses sped off in an unknown direction to Visha. The whole situation seemed like some kind of lie. She didn't understand at all what was happening now, because 30 minutes ago she was in the banquet hall. And now she, along with the weakling prince, was dragged off somewhere by an incomprehensible gang of thieves. Just 30 minutes ago, Her Highness heard a noise in the bushes and discovered a cat of an unknown breed there. She had never seen such a cat before. It had snow-white fur, and it washed itself by licking its paw. Vishnahel was amazed to see how fluffy her fur was. She thought it was very cute. Soon the cat jumped somewhere, and Her Highness the princess completely lost sight of her. The princess was about to return to the hall, but then the prince appeared shouting about some kind of gravitational barrier. He started to get sucked in there, and Visha, grabbing him by the leg and trying to save him, also found herself trapped. After this, they were thrown out onto some mountain road, and the princess fell onto the prince's back. The universe apparently decided that they didn't have enough troubles, and they landed right in the middle of a bandit raid on a caravan. The princess, seeing the enraged bandit, asked him to stop, saying that they were nobles and would be generously rewarded. Vishnahel took out a piece of jewelry with a red stone, and showing it to the bandit, said that if he sold it, he would understand how expensive it was. Thus, Princess Vishnahel managed to save their lives, but they did not understand what to do next. The prince woke up and, calling the princess an idiot, reminded her that he asked her not to go into the portal. Vishnahel slapped the prince to wake him up and ordered him to listen to her carefully. She explained to him that they had fallen into a hole in space and had come across bandits robbing caravans. I had to lie that the prince was a nobleman from a collateral branch, and he fled from his own people, hiding with the merchants. And Visha pretended to be a noblewoman of Kisomalos, and if the prince did not remember this, they would be finished. The bandits stopped the cart and announced that they had arrived. The bandits had set up huge portable tents, which surprised Vishu, but there was nowhere to run. There was a bare plain everywhere. The bandit ordered the children to go into the large tent and said that he had been told to treat them as guests. The prince stopped Vishnahel and asked if she thought it was okay to just walk in there. The princess grabbed his hand and called the prince a little pain in her ass. Vishnakal was confident and asked the boy to behave calmly and not to forget what they had agreed on. Entering the temporary tent, the princess loudly greeted the bandits and thanked them for their hospitality. The man cooking the soup allowed them to pass and said that he did not expect to meet his guests during the robbery. Having said that there is a first time for everything, the princess, holding the prince's hand, walked forward to the owner of the tent. The bandit asked his guests to eat a soup made from offal and said that they had recently slaughtered a cow for the soup. The prince, hearing the word offal, was horrified and asked if it wasn't only savages who ate such things. Vishnahel, seeing that the prince was setting them up, suggested that the bandit lock him in the barn. The bandits actually listened to the princess, tied up the boy and carried him to the barn, and the princess prepared for the meal. Borov gave a lecture to Vishi's friends in which he said that it is always better to strike first. It was already late at night, and Croa and Achilles were nodding off, not even understanding what the emperor was chatting about. Hearing his students asking to go to bed, he grumbled that young people were not what they used to be and that he had been more serious at their age. A frightened servant ran into the room and informed His Majesty that bad news had arrived. A telegram arrived with information that the princess and the fifth prince were missing. Kroa and Sally, upon hearing this news, were very scared and worried about Princess Vishnahel. Borov, in anger, broke the piece of chalk he was holding into dust, and the servant clarified that the emperor's army was already conducting a search. The emperor had already given the order to move out, but Achilles warned him that he could not leave the palace. If he does this, there is a very high probability that a hidden power struggle will begin. Borov really didn't like the fact that something like this could actually happen, and he was afraid of betrayal. Achilles proudly asked His Highness to remember why the princess decided to go there. Vishnahel's friends looked at His Highness in silence and waited for him to speak after he had listened to their arguments. Borov grinned as he looked at them and called them naughty children. The emperor announced that he would give them a week to find the princess, and then he would gather an army and set out on a campaign, crushing Medea from the start. After this, the emperor took the children to bed, and Kroa wondered why the emperor mentioned Medea. Medea was blocking the way, and Kroa offered to help the emperor in case of emergency. He said that there was a secret passage for the heir to the throne inside the palace, and promised to draw a map. The boar, hearing this, appreciated the boy and was surprised that even he could sometimes be very useful. After stroking the prince on the head, he asked him to go and rest in his room and not to worry unnecessarily. Looking at the emperor as he left, Kroa agreed with him and told himself that Lady Visha would be fine. Keeping his fingers crossed for Her Highness the Princess, he said that she was under the divine protection of the great Kisamalos. On the third day, Vishnahel felt great and was completely in sync with the bandits. The princess, carrying water in buckets and being held captive by bandits, decided that she could not lead an idle life. Vishnahel learned to milk a goat from the bandits and, having finished the job, carried a bucket of milk. The princess handed the buckets to the cook and decided to ask him what awaited them for breakfast today. The fifth prince was still in the barn and ate only the potatoes that the princess gave him. Suddenly, someone addressed Princess Vishnahel, calling Her Majesty a child. The man said that all the jewelry and valuables they were wearing could only be sold in a big city. Upon learning of this, he assumed that such jewels could not have gone to a collateral branch of the family. Afterwards, he said that he had sold the jewels anyway and could leave at any moment, which reassured the princess. Vishnahel hoped that her father would be able to trace the route of the sale of the jewelry and find it as soon as possible. The bandits discovered an unusually large airship in the sky. Something was falling from the ship. It was that same cousin Chaco, who pathetically landed right on the ground. Calling the bandits watching him monsters, he began to draw his weapons from their sheaths and shouted that he would destroy them. Vishnahel decided to protect the bandits and ordered not to kill them because it was just an accident. Chaco understood the order, but still decided to subdue them, knocking them out with a blow to the neck. He promised to talk about this with the imperial soldiers and went on to pacify the bandits. The princess reported where the prince was and saw an old woman descending by parachute, who asked her about her health. The chamberlain embraced Her Highness and said that the princess had become half her size. A touching scene took place between the old woman and Her Majesty, where they cried because they were very nervous. The beaten robber, sitting on his knees, told the princess what he felt and wanted not to get involved then. Vishnahel took pity on them, saying that she would not take the money and that they should improve their lives. The prince did not agree with the princess's decision and insisted on cutting off those heads, but the princess believed that he himself was to blame. Placing her hand on her chest, Her Highness asked the fifth prince to let these bandits go in peace. She showed him a photo of him greedily eating potatoes with tears in his eyes and promised to distribute it if he disobeyed. The prince agreed, and the princess put her fingers to her temple, saying with this gesture that she and the robbers were even. The bandits wished the princess a good journey and compared her to a powerful natural disaster. Emperor Astyages was displeased and thought that Borov was spoiling the princess too much, so he presented such an absurd list of damages. Vishnahel raised her hand and shared with the emperor that it was their fault and that the security system needed improvement. The emperor threw her out the door, and the prince, holding her hand, explained that she was the first one to be thrown out like that. The princess remembered the incriminating evidence and gave the prince a photo of the potato as a lasting memory. The prince took the photo and said that if she needed a partner for a political marriage, she should call him. He was not destined to inherit the throne of Astyages, but the conditions from Kisamalos would be good. The princess realized that it was because of the large number of heirs, and the prince said that he wanted to hear words of gratitude instead. Vishnahel exhaled, and thinking that it was unlikely that anyone would hire such an incompetent person, promised to think about it. The prince told the princess that he had a lot to do and asked her not to forget to send her a letter. Vishnahel immediately forgot everything, and all her thoughts were only about going shopping with the old woman. The airship landed, and Her Highness, wearing rose-colored glasses, was glad that she was finally in her homeland. The chamberlain bought the princess everything she wanted, and after taking her medicine she got back without any problems. Now all that remained was to show His Majesty the Pope a worthy return of his daughter, the princess. Vishnahel opened her eyes wide and looked through her new rose-colored glasses at the one who was calling her by name. The boar and the princess's friends looked at Her Highness the Princess with great concern. The emperor could not restrain himself and hugged the little princess, as he was very worried about her. Vishnahel began to cry, complaining to her father about the stupid princes, the scars and other problems she had experienced. Borov did not understand a word because of the princess's tears, but he said that he realized how much she had suffered. The prince, seeing the princess, realized that she was only pretending to hold herself with dignity, but upon seeing her father, she showed her weak side. Wiping away her tears, the princess immediately asked the emperor a question, asking how Chaco landed from the airship. She asked why he didn't use them for the army, but moved everything with the help of tanks. Achilles admired that Visha, even after such events, decided to create an aerial combat transport system. The emperor, hearing that Vishnakal wanted to create an air force, was proud of her and promised to kiss her on the cheek. The princess did not like such gratitude, and she stopped him, afraid that she would be slobbered on. Borov said that objectively the princess's snot was much more disgusting than his kiss on the cheek. The princess said that subjectively she didn't care, but the boar still kissed the little princess. Vishnahel looked again at the hilarious photo she had given to Prince Nanak. Before he could get into the palace, Borov made a huge scene in front of the gates, crying, screaming, and all that sort of thing. In general, the princess, as the official representative of Kisamalos, had to provide an official report. Having gathered Borov, the chamberlain's wife, and her friends, Vishnakel asked for attention and asked permission to report. She reported that as soon as they landed and the princess exited the airship, she fell into some strange wormhole. Borov watched with pride as the princess recounted her recent incredible adventures. Vishnahel continued to talk about what had happened and ended by saying that she was here again. Achilles and Croa were simply delighted with the story they heard and could not contain their emotions. Borov reported that this matched his information perfectly and declared the report complete. The chamberlain said that she was very tired and, asking for forgiveness, went to rest. She ordered Achilles and Croa to go with her without question. Vishnahel said that she had finished her report and wanted to go to her palace. She still had some souvenirs left. The boar stopped the princess to show her something interesting and asked her to look straight ahead. Achilles, seeing something unusual, asked to pay attention and was very surprised. On the tower, a man was tied with a rope, hanging upside down and asking Her Highness for help. Vishnahel was very surprised that he was asking for help. Although he had recently jumped from a ship, the boar said that he was afraid of heights. He is Her Highness's guard, and it would be fair to punish him for failing to fulfill his duties. Vishnahel, together with Achilles and Croa, watching what was happening, understood what the emperor wanted to show them. The princess couldn't understand why Chaco was afraid of heights, even though he had thrown himself off the fortress and climbed the towers more than once. He was exhausted, so he didn't think clearly, and when he climbed down, he simply didn't look down. The princess asked if he had jumped out of the airship for her, which really surprised Borov. The princess confirmed once again that he simply jumped without a parachute and ended up right in front of her. Borov, hearing this, took up the megaphone to give his cousin credit for his efforts. His Majesty pardoned Chaco, reducing his sentence to an hour, but the cousin continued to beg for it to be removed. After these manipulations, the emperor allowed his daughter, the princess, to rest, and she happily agreed. The friends were glad to see Lady Vishu safe and sound and were very worried about her. They said that His Majesty, having received the telegram and learned about what was happening, was very angry. If he had really decided to leave, he would have had to break through Medea, but the prince told him that he knew a secret passage. In this way, he could easily capture Medea and reach Astiges to rescue the princess. Vishnahel said that this was all, of course, cool, but how dare he reveal the secrets of Medea's kingdom? Croa said that he was a prisoner of Vishnahel, and it was his duty to do this, but the princess reminded him that he was still a prince. Thinking that he had done something important after all, she decided to reward him and asked what he wanted. He said that he just wanted to spend more time with Lady Visha. The princess agreed, since it was not difficult. Achilles watched what was happening and was simply furious and very angry at the poor prince. She was furious and jumping around him, saying that he was just making fun of her. The guy didn't understand her. Sally explained that he had just looked at her with his smug face and smirked. The prince laughed and suggested that young Achilles must have simply imagined it. Vishnahel suggested that the two men should mend their relationship, as they were friends. Unfortunately, neither Achilles nor Croa understood what they were doing wrong and simply said that they were trying their best. A week later, when Vishnahel was having her hair braided, she heard some unpleasant noise. The princess tried to guess whether it was Sally or maybe Croa, but her pet ram walked through the door. Kisomalos praised his heir, as she had regained some of her divine power. Vishnahel and her maid Emily were shocked, their mouths open in horror when they saw this picture. All the servants were frightened and tore their hair when they saw that Her Majesty's pet could talk. The princess kicked out the servants and ordered them to keep their mouths shut, otherwise they would end up like that old ram. The maid ran out of the room like a bullet, her eyes full of horror, and did not want to go back there. Vishnahel examined the ram again carefully and asked if he was really Lord Kisomalos. The ram with golden wool folded his hooves and said that of course it was him. What doubt could there be? Pointing at himself with his hoof, he repeated that he was that same wonderful god, but in spiritual form. Vishnahel grabbed his paw and began to twist it, asking why he couldn't choose the place and time. Having caught his breath, the ram announced that he was in a hurry, and that his ability to communicate might be temporary. Kisomalos suggested that she might be speaking because the old woman had warm feelings for her, and her guardian god was known for his eloquence. And the golden-haired one even knew him, he was so famous, but Vishu was surprised by another fact about the hag. She couldn't believe that Grandma actually fell in love with Her Highness Princess Vishnahel. The princess tried to understand where they had become so close, whether it was because they had cried on each other's shoulders. Kisomalos, having analyzed everything that happened recently, said that precisely these events, is the whole point. People can only realize that someone is very close and dear to them when they lose them or their connection with them. Vishnahel accepted that she was dear to the old woman, but one fact still prevented her from accepting it. She didn't understand why, before she went back in time, the old woman never came to visit her until she grew up. Kisomalos interrupted the princess because he came to tell her important information. Vishnahel, her eyes shining, waited for her to be dealt a trump card that would help her restore her divine power. The lamb got angry because if you don't take care of his wool, it gets matted and it's very hot, so he demanded to be cut. Vishnahel was shocked that he had made all this fuss just to tell her this. The princess pounced on him and began to strangle him, since he could set them up, and others could find out that he had lost his divinity. Kisomalos suddenly realized that he really wanted to talk about a very important topic related to divinity. Vishnahel demanded that he tell her quickly before he forgot again, and the golden-haired man began to tell her. But as soon as he began, he lost his voice again, which enraged the princess, and she called the maids to get rid of the ram. Her Majesty decided that today she would just lie around and do nothing else, as she was tired. Suddenly someone entered the room and once again disturbed the peace of Her Majesty Princess Vishnahel. A handsome emperor stood before her in a pompous pose, and the princess asked why her father had come to see her. His Majesty said that he simply missed his daughter, and Visha suggested that they play together. Taking Her Highness by the shoulders, the emperor explained that now was not the time for games. He put the little princess in his arms and told her that today she needed to do something with her friends. The boar blew his whistle and announced to the princess and her friends to gather for a general roll call. Vishnahel, smiling, proudly shouted that she had arrived first at the general roll call. The second was the green-haired Achilles, who was already ready to use her mental abilities. Kroa was third, and he asked if it was really necessary to strike a pose when you called out your number. Vishnakal was surprised and asked if Medea didn't already have such a wonderful and interesting tradition. His Majesty often played with the children, but today he brought them to a deserted place, which was new for them. Borov began to explain that although they grow up like wild stallions, accidents are inevitable, but they should not be injured. That is why the emperor introduced the boys to their new teacher in the martial art of pancration. Auntie hadn't settled things with Zephyros yet, so Borov found other martial arts trainers for them. The first was Lady Lee, the Baroness's daughter and a certified level 1 pancration specialist. She was in the next cell with Visha and was sitting there for breaking the bones of one of the Zephyros who wanted to marry her if he won the duel. Kroa asked Vishnahel and Sally to try, since he himself could not walk, and therefore could not study either. The girls surrounded the prince and said that in pancration there is also a ground floor, so he will have to practice. The boar expected such an answer and prepared something especially for the young prince. Holding the skates in his hands, he explained that if they allow the use of bicycles, then there should be no questions about this either. Vishnahel looked at this and could not understand where the emperor got them from, or whether he had a magic robe. It was still difficult for Kroa to keep his balance, and Lady Visha was helping him. The prince asked them not to let him go yet. Achilles suggested that when Kroa actually learned to balance, it would be incredibly cool. Seeing how well the prince skated, the girls all shouted in unison that they wanted skates like that too. The boar told them to go to the old hag, who would find them a shoemaker and make them a pair of such skates. Borov looked around again, realized that he was no longer needed here, and said goodbye to them. Vishnakel waved her hand to her father and asked him to take care of himself and continue in the same spirit. The martial arts teacher took a stand and called Her Majesty and her friends to her. Vishnahel also tried to get into a stance and asked when their first martial arts lesson would begin. Taking out a toothbrush and a toy jaw, Lee began by teaching her how to properly brush her teeth. Achilles asked a good question when she asked how brushing her teeth was related to this martial art. The teacher said that biting is allowed in this martial art, and the force of clenching the teeth is very important. Croa said that he could not understand the culture of Kisamalos, and Achilles added that Medea had the same culture. Vishnahel was given a toothbrush and asked if the princess brushed her gums. She replied that she did not. Lee also took a brush and, putting it to her teeth, announced that the first lesson in brushing teeth was declared open. The warm weather, where the princess had a good time, passed very quickly. The children had picnics. Achilles and Croa continued to argue, which often turned into fights without rules. Everything was completely different than before Princess Vishnahel accidentally returned to the past. Before Her Highness the princess had time to come to her senses, 2 whole wonderful years had quickly passed.